All right, we'll open up the West Ada School Board meeting for tonight, and the first thing on the agenda is to do the Pledge of Allegiance. All right, Clerk Newbold, are there any additions or changes to the agenda?
Madam Chair, Trustees, Superintendent Reynolds, I have added all the patron comments to the website on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. And for the board, we actually had to update the agenda, so our first item up is an action item to approve the amended agenda. So I would open it up for motions. Trustee Kofelt.
Madam Chair, I'll make a motion that we approve the amended agenda.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the amended agenda. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries 5-0. All right, that moves us into regular session, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say this feels great, you guys, to have all the trustees and the superintendent and the clerk up here and to see all of you in the audience. So it just feels a little bit closer to normal, even if you're all we still have to all wear our masks. It's great to see faces in the room. So, Mr. Myers, I'm looking around. Oh, you were behind the computer for me. You're up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, trustees, and Superintendent Dr. Reynolds. This evening, it is an honor to represent the learning community at Discovery Elementary. Before sharing the recommendation for building principal, I would like to take a moment to share our gratitude for the leadership of Principal Rhonda McDonough. Ms. McDonough's dedication to the students and families at Discovery is commendable. I also want to express our appreciation for the members of the Discovery Building Recommendation Team for their leadership, insight, and vision. These members were Carmen Uskala, Amanda Ravello, Robin Kearns, Ashley Kalinsky, Allie Anderson, Lindsay Watsaba, Jessica Jensen, Jeremiah Katz, and Tom Runyon. Representing the executive team, it is recommended Brittany Amos be the principal of Discovery Elementary. Since 2005, Ms. Amos has been an educator in the West Ada School District. She has taught at the elementary level, learned as an elementary intern, and currently leads as the assistant principal at Desert Sage Elementary. Brittany is dedicated to seeing all learners succeed. She describes herself as having a passion and love for the job where we are in the business of teaching and learning. She is a servant leader who leads by example and builds professional capacity, knowing that student achievement is paramount in all decisions. We are looking forward to watching the learning community at Discovery Elementary continue to celebrate successes with Brittany Amos as their new leader. Ms. Amos is here with us this evening, and after sharing a few words, can address any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Amos, welcome to the board.
All right, Chairwoman Johnson, trustees, Superintendent Dr. Reynolds. Thank you, Mr. Myers, for the kind words that you shared today. I am completely humbled and honored to be able to continue the amazing work at Discovery that Rhonda McDonough has started and built at that school. With the amount of time that I spent with the building team with my interview, it was easy to see how dedicated that staff, our staff, is to kids and how passionate they are to see things continue. And although this is bittersweet as I leave behind the great teamwork that I have with Lisa Hale, the principal at Desert Sage, and our amazing staff there, I am excited for the opportunity that lies ahead and the future of the coming years at the school.
Thank you. Any questions, comments from trustees? Thank you. I'd be remiss if I didn't say you're going from a great school to another great one. I've had kids that have been around in both, so
Awesome.
Good luck.
Thank you. I would agree.
Sorry, Trustee Kofelt.
It's okay.
I'm quick on the draw tonight. It's a big agenda. Mr. Myers. Oh, Well, you know what? Do it. That's not very respectful of me. No, get out there.
No, I just wanted to say, I liked how you already said our staff at the new school, so you've already embraced it. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. You keep me on board, keep me on track here, please.
Again this evening, Chairwoman Johnson, trustees, and Superintendent Dr. Reynolds. Again this evening, it is my pleasure to represent the team, students, and families at Lewis and Clark Middle School. Before I share that recommendation for building principal, I would like to recognize Principal Kelly Davies and express our gratitude for her years of service and leadership. I also want to thank the members of the Lewis and Clark building recommendation team for their professionalism, insight, and leadership. These members were Assistant Principal Kate Hunter, Assistant Principal Danny Solomon, Maria Bonarotti, Marian Nebergich, Sarah Suggs, Andrea Barrowald, Sharon Hatler, Aaron Harris, Kayla Kiemel, Jennifer Dunlop, Andrew Yarborough, Sarah Wilson, and Ricky Appel. Representing the executive team, Monty Hyde is recommended as the principal of Lewis and Clark Middle School. Mr. Hyde was a high school counselor, middle school counselor, and elementary teacher. In 2012, he started as a counselor at Meridian High School, and in 2015, after completing the administrative intern program, Monty became the assistant principal at Sawtooth Middle School, where he continues to serve today. Student achievement, whole child supports, and highly reliable systems of learning are foundational to Monty's leadership. He recognizes the value of and purposely plans strategies that establish collaborative, inviting, and student-centered school culture. We are looking forward to watching the learning community at Lewis and Clark Middle School continue to celebrate success with Monty Hyde as their new leader. Mr. Hyde is here with us this evening, and after sharing a few words, he also can address any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hyde, welcome to the board.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson, trustees, Superintendent Dr. Reynolds. Extremely excited for this opportunity. Grateful for the recommendation. Grateful for everything that Marcus has done as well. Looking forward to everything that we're going to accomplish in the coming years at Lewis and Clark. After sitting in through the interviews with the staff, I knew right away this is a community. And I think Marcus said it earlier as well up here that they do embrace community, and I am so ready to be a part of that and continue that community and that collaborative culture that they have at Lewis and Clark. So extremely excited and extremely ready for the challenge, so thank you guys.
Thank you. Trustee Ozuna.
My children were fortunate to be part of the Lewis and Clark community, so I think you're going to fit in well there. Congratulations.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations. Mr. Myers, before you head off, something that, since we have a couple new trustees, including myself, can you tell us a couple quick things about these, how the process works? So how many applications do you typically get for kind of these jobs? And then what is the building leadership team, what's their role in the process? Because I think I've learned a few things, but I don't know if the whole board knows how this works. And it'd be helpful to know, because I think there's some cool ways that you guys work through this.
Absolutely. Chairwoman Johnson, trustee, and Dr. Reynolds. Typically for positions, and for these two positions on average, we had about 20 applicants, some more, some a little less on either one. Applicants ranged from leaders within the West Ada School District, current interns, assistant principals, and some folks outside of the district as well. Building recommendation teams are created through input from building principals administration and the leadership team that exists in the school already. And we try to build a team of about 10 staff members that well represent that building, classified support staff, paraprofessional staff, and certified teaching staff from many different departments. We then meet at those buildings with those staff members and talk about their vision for the school and moving forward, where they're at and their goals, and how that next leader can help springboard them to that next area of learning. After identifying their celebrations, their successes, then we work together with that leadership team to develop building level questions that gain insight from the candidates toward meeting those goals and where they're at. And really that process is incredibly valuable in that it's a strengthening opportunity for that team in identifying the school's mission, vision, values, and goals and what they hold dear. and at the same time, an opportunity for them to celebrate and be able to celebrate that information with their next leader. And so that information, we take that information and share that with the next leader for whoever we recommend or approve by you. I think that we also use the building recommendation information to develop questions at a district level for when we interview an executive team. So all in all, that's the process where we meet with building recommendation teams, typically 2 to 3 times. It depends on the work and the length of the time of those meetings, but we do involve them and want to make sure that we use it as an opportunity to grow and strengthen their leadership team as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Mosier. Welcome.
Madam Chair, trustees, Dr. Reynolds. Before I get into the recommendation, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for representing the board during our Teacher of the Year and Classified Employee of the Year ceremony. I know it means a lot to all of our recipients, and I know it adds to a busy month for all of you, but thank you for being there on behalf of all of our recipients. Good evening. It is with great pleasure and honor that I bring forward a recommendation for the principal position at Prospect Elementary. But before I do that, I'd like to recognize a variety of individuals for the time and effort they spent throughout the process. The interviewing practice at the building, as you know, at the building level includes meeting with a committee of staff members to draft questions that represent the entire school community and then conducting the interviews. The Prospect staff members on this committee engaged in specific, thoughtful, and professional dialogue that brought forward 3 candidates for interviews with the executive team. The Prospect Elementary staff members that gave no less than 7 hours of their time to ensure they had the right fit for the school are the following, and we have a few of them here this evening. Connie Gormley, Stacy Young, Heather Bachman, Andrea Singleton, Michelle Mayfield, Colette Violet, Erica Brown, Rio Sparks, and Kathy Meyer. In addition to these outstanding educators, I would also like to acknowledge the executive team for their time and energy put into finding the right fit for Prospect. Lastly, I'd like to recognize the outgoing principal, Michelle Story. Michelle provided the Prospect Elementary School community with outstanding leadership for 4 years. I will personally miss working alongside Michelle, and I wish her the best as her journey in the West Ada School District continues. Tonight, I'm excited to bring forward Gwenda Venecia for your approval as the next Prospect Elementary principal. Gwenda has spent all of her employment and education in the West Ada School District. Currently, Gwenda is splitting her time between Star Elementary and Eagle Hills Elementary as an intern assistant principal, and prior to her time as an intern, Gwenda taught at Chief Joseph Elementary. In addition to her administrative and teaching experience, Gwenda brings other experiences within the district that help set her apart from other candidates. When we say Gwenda has done it all, she really has done it all. So that'll be a good question that you can ask her. Gwenda is an outstanding instructional leader that will continue to enhance the structure and support needed for students and staff to be successful. The foundation for her success will be her ability to build and sustain relationships. Trustees, Dr. Reynolds, it is without hesitation that I recommend Gwenda Venecia as the next principal for Prospect Elementary. Gwenda is here to share a few words and to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Welcome to the board.
Thank you so much. Madam Chair, trustees, and Dr. Reynolds, I am beyond honored that the executive team has recommended me as principal for Prospect Elementary. As Mr. Moser said, the current principal, Michelle Story, has been a strong leader in that building and has created a wonderful culture and a wonderful environment. As you can tell by 3 of the staff members being here and bringing me flowers and wonderful gifts to welcome me to the team, I am so excited to be a part of this community, and I look forward to continuing the journey with this staff. This is exciting, so exciting. I have been blessed to be in this school district for quite a time in a variety of positions, and I have learned from so many people and have had so many wonderful mentors, several of which have come tonight, and I'm just so grateful for that. This year, I got to be the vice principal under 2 veteran principals, Jason LaForgie and Carla Carnes, and what I've learned from them is amazing, and I will take with me for years to come. Thank you so, so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. Any comments, questions from the trustees? Trustee Gofelt, I was waiting, somebody has to ask.
Well, Mr. Moser said that you have done it all, and that could take a while to talk about, so why don't we just say, what haven't you done? No, just kidding. I'm totally just kidding. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we have a spotlight up, and Mr. Gillen, I figure you'll introduce everybody else. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Trustees, Superintendent. I'm excited to visit with you tonight a little bit about bonds. As you probably saw from the agenda, what we're going to do is we're going to start walking through, and I'm going to introduce you to a potential bond offering that we would do and a restructuring of our debt. As part of that process, what we really wanted to be able to convey with you tonight is a little bit about the team that we'll be working with, and give you an opportunity to learn a little bit about the bond process, ask questions, again, meet some of the folks that the district will be having help us with this process, and start to get your feet wet a little bit on what the structure is going to look like and next steps. So again, I'll do introductions of the bond team. I'll walk through some slides, and then one of them, Chelsea Porter specifically, will refer to some of the legal documents, and at the end there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions and get them more involved as well. We're going to talk a little bit about the structure of the bond sale itself, a little bit of the why, and then we'll walk through legal documents again. Then I'll talk about next steps and a little bit of the calendar so you can kind of get an idea of how the process is going to go. So the bond team. So the first person is Christian Anderson. He works with Zion's Bank, and Christian's role in the process is our municipal finance advisor. And so really when you think about that, Christian's job really is to help represent us in the process. In many ways, he's an owner's rep, per se. And so he helps us walk through the process. He has a fiduciary duty to the district and to help us walk through and analyze the bond process and work with our bond counsel from the perspective of West Ada. Eric Herringer and Michael Keith both work with Piper Sandler. For those of you who have been on the board, you've seen them, many of these folks before. They operate as the underwriter as part of the process. And so they'll help with the actual sale of the bonds. And then they also have a responsibility and work with investors themselves to be purchasing the bonds. And then Nick Miller couldn't be here tonight, but Nick Miller and Chelsea Porter work for Holly Troxel, and they provide bond or legal counsel as part of the process. So they'll walk through documents. There's a lot of legal documents that are issued as part of the bond process. They'll ensure those documents are accurate. They'll also ensure that it's a legal and valid and binding obligation for the district. So essentially, what is the structure of the bond sale? What are we going to do? We're looking to do an advance refunding of the 2015 bonds we did, and we're going to pull forward our 2026 and 2034 maturities. So we're going to look at accelerating around $50 million in debt that will essentially become payable in 2022 in years 2022 through 2024. There'll be a district contribution of roughly $4.25 million, and again, total size of the bond sale is we're going to be right at $59.8 million, and that'll consist of principal and premium and a district contribution. Refunded bonds, as you can see from a coupon rate, which we'll kind of walk through as we get a little further on in the bond process. We won't spend as much time with that tonight. And then things to think about, it will be a taxable bond. And so that is specifically because of the way laws have changed with tax law, and so we'll have to issue it taxable as opposed to non-taxable. And Chelsea would be great if you would love to talk to her about tax law for hours on end about why that is. See how I quickly pass that off to you. So the why. Why do we want to do this? It'll give us an opportunity to save our taxpayers money. So $11.4 million in savings is the estimate. Again, we're pretty early on in the process, right? So expect that these numbers will change a little bit as we look at rates and as we obviously go to market. Present value percentage, you can see that we're going to be able to save some dollars there. We'll maximize an increase in market value. So as our area is growing, as our market values are growing, this will allow us to be able to capture some savings, take advantage of reduced interest rates, reduce our overall debt burden for the district, and always is something that we look to do as part of our debt management plan is be able to do this and save taxpayers money while at the same time still maintaining our levy rate and still be able to plan for our capital in the future. So as we, even with the decisions we would make if you move forward with this process, we'll still be able to look at our current capital plan and be able to meet the needs should we have bonding in the future. So I thought I'd provide a little picture as opposed to just words. What you can see from this is essentially the dotted line is our current debt service, and so that's if we made no changes, what our debt service would look like. And then you can start to see The difference between the two, obviously the brown is the debt that we would be pulling forward, and you'll see obviously the white space or the gap from the debt that we basically pulled forward that now we would, so we have a gap in debt service as it drops over time. So again, moving some maturities up, allowing for the debt burden to be less later. Legal documents. Ready to talk, Chelsea?
Mr. Gillen, if the board wants to ask some questions, do you want them to wait till the end, or do you want to ask you first before we?
Why don't we wait till the end? Is that okay?
Okay, that's fine.
Perfect. Thank you.
Madam Chair, trustees, Dr. Reynolds, I am Chelsea Porter from Holly Troxel. And yeah, I'll just jump right into the documents. The purpose of tonight is, again, to just preview very big picture the legal documents that would be in front of you at next month's board meeting should you guys choose to move forward with this bond restructuring. And the main document that would be the action item next month is the bond resolution, which is essentially authorizing the issuance and sale of the bonds. And within that, you're also authorizing forms of other documents. And, well, let me go next here first. So I don't get, oh wait, is it the arrows? Yeah, arrows. Maybe? Yeah, it's not. Okay. So here's the title of the bond resolution. And as you can see, we've highlighted kind of a relevant provision of the title, which is delegating authority to approve terms and provisions and providing for related matters. So the purpose of this is to allow us to come to your board meeting at a regularly scheduled meeting and then sell the bonds at a date thereafter, subject to certain parameters that the board will place upon that sale. And so if they meet those parameters, then the district can move forward with it. And the related matters relates to the additional documents that I was saying, and those documents will be pretty much final at the time you approve the bond resolution, but there are certain details that can't be finalized until the sale of the bonds, and so you're authorizing those moving forward as well. So those documents are the official statement, which is the disclosure document to the market, and that just includes pretty much all the information about the district and the state and area generally that investors would want to know prior to purchasing the district's bonds. The bond purchase agreement is the contract with Piper Sandler to actually purchase those bonds from the district. The escrow agreement, Jonathan briefly touched on it, but the bonds that we would be refunding aren't actually callable for a few years, and so we need to escrow those funds and put them in an account solely for the purpose of paying off those bonds when they are callable. And the final document is an information reporting agreement, and this is essentially another contract with the bondholders stating that you will provide updated information from that preliminary official statement on an annual basis going forward, so long as those bonds are outstanding. And the district has several of these. You have to enter into a new one with every bond issue, so this isn't a new obligation for the district. And so here's a picture of that preliminary official statement. Some of you have seen them before. It's a very thick document, super exciting to read, lots of nitty-gritty details, but also a big picture of the district as well. And then these last few slides are just excerpts from what the bond resolution would say, and it just provides you with the language within that bond resolution showing that you would be authorizing these documents. So delegated officers would be Dr. Reynolds and Jonathan as your chief financial officer, and they would be the ones that on the day of the sale, so long as the sale complies with the parameters you've delegated, gives them authority to move forward. So you'll see delegated officers referred to in a few of these slides. But really, these last few slides just show, in 208G, you're approving the information reporting agreement. There will be a substantially final version of that document attached to the bond resolution for you. Again, the bond purchase agreement, same thing, and the escrow agreement. And again, these just can't be finalized at the time you would be authorizing the sale, and so that is why you're really only, approving the form thereof. And I think that is the end. So I can answer questions now while I'm here, if you have them. I know I just threw a ton of information at you, but it's kind of your opportunity to ask big picture questions before we come back at you with, 150 pages of documents that probably aren't super easily digestible.
Would you mind if, are you going to be around for us, like as we go through the whole thing, we can maybe have the questions kind of come at the end for all of you? Is
Sure.
that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
All right. So we're talking about next steps. So obviously tonight is an opportunity to, once we'll be done with the presentation, for you guys to start asking questions. We'll be able to gather some feedback. Next steps for us, we have to submit an initial application to the Idaho School Bond Guarantee Program. It's a $250, pretty nominal fee. That essentially lets the state treasurer know that we would be doing this process, and so it gets them able to get started on their work. During the time between now and the next board meeting, the bond team will start working on preparation and refinement of the preliminary official statement. So that's that very large document that Chelsea referenced. There's a lot of work that Christian and Piper Sandler will be working on along with bond counsel, and then of course district staff will also be providing a bunch of financial data as well and then reviewing that document. We'll also work with the bond team to draft legal documents, and then we'll have a bond resolution that will be available at the first part of the May board meeting. And so, again, this is a preliminary schedule. It's a lot to take in tonight, so I just want you to know there is flexibility. We'll walk through kind of what the schedule looks like right now, give you an opportunity to ask some questions. There'll be more information that will continue to come out over the next couple of weeks, and then when we all get back together, we'll have another opportunity to talk about what that means and your comfort level with moving forward. So again, this kind of just gives you a little bit of an understanding of what the schedule looks like when you look to issue a bond. So we'll have our initial conversation tonight. Again, that guarantee application. Folks will start working in the background. So preparing all the documents necessary for the sale. It'll be the regular board meeting. And then after that, if you choose to move forward at the board meeting, we get the rating agency involved and they look at a rating for the bond and we receive that rating and then we step forward into the sale and the closing. And like I said, this is a dates based on the timeline we have at the time, but obviously they're subject and available. We can continue to make adjustments as we walk through the process. And with that, now we can start to answer some questions.
Mr. Gillen, because you and I have talked about this offline, I want to just set the stage for kind of because we've gotten a lot of details, but there's really a policy decision above this, right? And I don't know, do you want to kind of talk about the policy decision that's in front of us before we get into the details of the bond, or do you want me to try my best to talk about that decision for the board?
Madam Chair and trustees, I can take based on the conversation we've had. It's really a discussion around how we want to structure our debt, right? And so as we look at moving the debt forward, obviously there is an impact on how it is that works for today, right? And so taxpayers, there's a lot of conversation about how taxes work and whether the long term of the bond and how you structure a bond sale and do you stretch out provisions and how much do you put in early? And so it's always that discussion of do we look to save taxpayer dollars, which can also involve us shifting around a debt burden. And so a lot of that conversation comes with part of this process. Obviously, the opportunity exists by doing this to be able to generate some savings for taxpayers. It does also involve a shift in how we're going to have our bonds and what the bond payment will be, and the impact that has on current taxpayers today. And so if you want to help add to that conversation.
I'm just going to give you my point of view on it. We're faced with we're faced with a decision of keeping our levy rate the same today, which means we move some of that bond structure, and correct me if I've got it wrong, but move some of that bond structure forward, which means our levy rate stays the same. So for all of our taxpayers that are there today and property owners, that nothing changes on their levy rate. Or because we have some of our debt settling, we don't move something forward, we would see a levy rate go down. Doesn't necessarily mean taxes go down because prices of homes go up still. But then if we, in the future, if we go to bond, one of the things that we've always been able to say pretty much is that our levy rate stays the same because we've had some debt settle. In this case, we would actually have to raise the levy rate to bond in the future. So there's a kind of a long-term policy view and a short-term policy view. And I wanted the board to kind of understand that. We've typically brought debt forward and kept the levy rate the same. That's been the historical. And personally, I think we want to keep doing that, but I also wanted everybody to have kind of the same level of understanding around the decision that we would make around that.
If I might add, Madam Chair and trustees, one of the slides, I feel really bad because I had it on my sheet but not on yours, was actually to be able to show you our levy rate over time has continued to drop. And so I believe in 2016 we were in the neighborhood of $4, and right now we're sitting around $2.38. So what we've been able to do with lots of things, great management from the board, great management from folks at the district, great work done by the bond team, is for us to be able to structure debt in such a way that we can still reduce our levy rate and still also be able to manage the debt burden that we have in the future and be able to not have to increase a levy should we go out to build new schools.
Yeah, that's true. Sorry, I probably missed that part. But ultimately, I think the policy question for us is, how do we want to position ourselves? I have some uncomfortability with positioning ourselves to, we're going to have to bond at some point in the future and also have to raise a levy rate at the same time. That's a pretty big burden to bear in both of those and causes some more unsuccessful potential in passing, which then hurts our kids, right? Because then we've got more crowding and all sorts of stuff. So that's kind of where I sit. But we've been able to drop the levy rate just depending on property tax values and all sorts of different ways that we've been able to manage through. So we drop it every time we can, even without having this decision in front of us.
Yeah. So. Chairman and trustees, and a lot goes into that levy, Madam Chair, sorry, force of habit, and trustees, superintendent. So a lot of that goes into a lot of factors we just don't have answers for yet, right? So next month, Mr. McQuaid is going to come and share a little bit about market values, right? And so those are numbers we really don't have yet, although I'm sure if you've looked around the valley, you can see construction is still happening. And so that'll impact inputs into the levy rate, along with our debt service, along with any other structures we do with debt as well.
Mr. Gillen, the other thing, and you put a timeline out there, you said there was some flexibility in it, though, and you and I had talked and you were going to check on it. Can you kind of give us, what's the board's flexibility in making this decision? Where's the drop dead point at?
Madam Chair, trustees, so we have to go on the extreme end, and Christian, you can help me out if I start, Christian's going to come up here if I start to push too far on the timeline. So our drop dead date becomes when we have to certify taxes, right? And so that happens all the way in September. Now, obviously, there is a bunch of work associated with that process before then. We couldn't wait till August to start making the decisions and then hope we can get all of the other steps. So we're going to want to back up, and Christian, do you want to come up and talk about what might be a good timeline to allow us some flexibility while still being able to make sure that we can meet all the things that'll be required as part of the process?
Yeah, Madam Chair, trustees, Dr. Reynolds. You can see, let's see if I can go back. The timeline here, we're kind of working from a set of, okay, from the time that you as a board say go, offer that green light, it's 6 to 8 weeks to carry out that process. So this was set up, I'll note that some of this work has already started. The official statement, we have a first draft that'll be ready to go later this week, that we can start on that process. Now that's okay, we could sit on that for time if you as a board wanted more time to make this decision. But certain things, like you can see the top of the second column, May 12th, package to the rating agency, we specifically held off on sending that and making that commitment that the district is going to get a rating until you as a board have specifically greenlit this process. So there's kind of two phases of an initial, yeah, we think this looks good, and then the actual approval at that board meeting. So you could push that back another meeting, decide in the next board meeting in May that, okay, let's go ahead and kind of start that process, then come back in June with the resolution. I would say at the latest, we would want that resolution to be adopted ideally in the July meeting. I suppose it could be done in August, but that is cutting it very close.
Thank you. That was I just wanted y'all to have the same, all of us to have the same context. but it's open for questions, however, if anybody has any. No, go ahead. Trustee Kofelt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A couple questions just around the whole bond process. One is this process is 6 to 8 week process. What will probably be the total cost to get the whole package together?
Yeah. Madam Chair, Trustees, Trustee Kofelt, the overall cost, there's numerous things that go into this. So there's, of course, Zion's fees as municipal advisor, the underwriting cost, bond counsel cost, the rating fee, the escrow fee with the trustee, escrow verification. There's quite a few things, but we're estimating something in the range of, I would say, $350,000 to $400,000 total. And I'll note that the estimated savings that were shown on an earlier slide incorporate those costs. So it's factored in there when we showed that estimated savings of over $11 million.
Follow up, Madam Chair. Thank you. Yeah. So that dollar amount to bring the whole package together, is that something that can be rolled in and included in the bond, or is that paid in addition to?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Trustees, that's included. So
Okay.
we typically will roll those in. Now, again, there is a contribution from the district that's factored in here. But, so, it's kind of fungible. Is it coming from the bond issue? Is it coming from the contribution? But, yeah, it is kind of wrapped into the whole thing. And I'll note that the district is not on the hook for any costs if really, we put that rating agency after the approval of the resolution, because once you have started that process, then there is that financial commitment at some point with the rating agency. Most of the work we do, so Zion's, Piper, we're on a completely contingent basis. If you don't issue bonds, you don't pay us. So most of the fees are like that. So you would not incur a cost until the bonds are issued, and all of these costs are paid at the time the bonds are sold and closed.
It would seem that if we're projecting $11.4 million savings, there's probably not a downside, but I'll ask the question anyways. Is there any negative to doing this?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Trustees, I can't think of any. I think it comes back, as the Chair described, kind of this policy decision of taking more of the long-term approach of we still have this capital plan ahead of us. We can lock in these savings now. These will save taxpayers over the years and provide capacity for future capital needs. Or do we take an immediate drop, recognizing that we will have to come back up at some point with growth? So I'd say it's more of that decision. I don't think there are any downsides to completing this when we look at the market. As Jonathan mentioned, these are taxable rates, but the key piece is taxable rates today are even lower than the tax exempt rates you're paying. So that's how we're able to create those savings. Rates are still, even though they've come up recently, they're still at historically low levels. So I'd say there's really no downside to what we're doing.
I'm good.
Any other trustees? Trustee Klopfenstein.
Thank you very much. I just had two quick questions, mostly because Mr. Gillen kind of addressed one of them, so I have to ask it. But the other one is, so if we're talking about these are not callable for a certain period of time, does that basically means we're going out for bond, but we really can't go out for bond until, we can't do anything with the money until the callable bonds are basically able to be refunded. Is that correct? I'm just trying to understand what that means and what the impact to the district is.
Madam Chair, Trustee Klopfenstein, the call feature, it refers to when you can pay the investors off. So in this case, the new bonds that we would issue, again, they'd mature in 2022 through 2024. They're so short, they would just be non-callable. We typically set bonds to be callable after 10 years. These are within that. That doesn't really have any impact on your ability to issue new bonds for new projects with voter approval. That's kind of independent of what we do with this refinancing. So these funds, the $50 million that we'd be generating in the bond sale, don't go to the district. They go to an escrow to pay off the old bonds.
So I guess that in terms of timeline, there's an overlap between when the old bonds can be paid off
There is.
and when the new bond is being incurred.
Yeah,
So do we have that kind of a weird period where we're increasing cost?
Yes and no. So I can go, let me try and go back a ways. So on the one hand, the bonds that we're refinancing are not callable until 2015. So that money, they were issued in 2015, callable in 2025. So the proceeds of the bond sale would go into an escrow. That escrow would then pay the interest on those bonds until that call date in 2025 and then pay them off. So there is that period of time essentially where you're paying interest on top of interest. What you have locked in though is that now all of that $50 million that was spread out from now until 2034 is now being paid in these next 3 years. So all of that white space you can see on the graph is the savings. So there is some inefficiency to it in its advanced refunding process, but we are still locking in a substantial amount of savings because you're paying it off so fast. But it is a unique situation where the bonds technically would still be outstanding even after the new bonds have been paid off. But once you've issued the new bonds, the district is only responsible for those new bonds. The escrow secures the old bonds. They come off your books.
Okay, so in terms of just risk, we're not really talking about increasing risk.
There's no risk.
Or there is no scenario of risk that during this period of 2 years that we could be incurring.
No. Once the new bonds are issued, they're invested in Treasury securities in the escrow. And in that way, again, they come off your books. They're not the district's responsibility anymore. You're only responsible for the new bonds, which would mature in 2022, 23, and 24.
Excellent. Okay, just one other question. I was curious.
Yeah.
What happens to this? So the savings from escrow, I'm assuming it generates savings. That money that's being generated then goes to the paying off the bonds that we have. Is that correct?
So,
beg your pardon, paying off the interest for the bonds. Excuse me.
So the money in the escrow is just paying the old bonds. So essentially, you need to have enough money at closing to fully fund that escrow. To cover those costs. So again, it's covering the interest payments on those bonds between now and the call date and then paying them off on the call date. The savings just come from the fact that you're going to, that $50 million, you're accelerating it, you're going to pay it for the next 3 years. And then for the 10 years after that, you're not paying anything on those bonds. All of that interest is captured as savings that you would have been paying otherwise.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Trustee Ozuna.
I have a question for Mr. Gillen. Thank you. Mr. Gillen, I understand the advantage of keeping our levy rate stable. Looking forward, if we were to run a larger bond, which would allow us to be ahead of the growth, would we be able to, in that situation, keep our levy rate stable, or would we potentially be looking at an increase? And does this factor into that at all?
Madam Chair, trustees, trying to think about the best way to answer. Some of those factors will be factors at the time that we go out and look at running that bond. And so when you say a large bond, let's say we ran a bigger, let's say we ran just a $100 million bond like what we did in the past with Owyhee and those things. The plan is still, even with this allows us the flexibility to still continue to be able to do things like that, to align with our capital plan. Obviously, some of that is based on our expectation of market rates, and if we had a recession that happened in the next year, right, and those could impact some of the factors associated with that. But much like the conversations we've had before, some of those situations that drive down market rates would probably also drive down our interest in maybe going to issue a bond at the time, right? So some of those problems end up solving themselves. But this will essentially allow us the time to be able to look at our enrollment needs and be able to look at the needs and the capital needs of the district, while at the same time be able to generate savings and allow us to hopefully be able to fit those new bonds in what is our current levy rate structure. And did that answer your question?
Any other questions or comments? Mr. Gillen, I have a request.
Yes.
Can you show the board, when we come back to this discussion next, some scenarios? So I think I heard kind of really 3 policy option scenarios, and I'll let you work on the assumptions around them. One is no change, like we don't do anything. What's that look like from a cost, savings, levy rate perspective? This plan, what's that look like from that same, and if I'm missing an evaluation factor, please add one in, but these are the ones I heard. And then the third one is if we had a large bond where we wanted to get ahead, what does that look like? And we can use some assumptions around current market, but I think we need to be able to see some scenarios of what those are, and that will help us make some decisions around where we want to go, because I do know we have talked about that large bond, and I'm glad Trustee Ozuna brought it up, because that's a big factor in this decision for us. I think I hadn't thought of before, so it would be nice to see that in a scenario too.
Perfect. Can do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any other questions, comments, thoughts? I always ask the kids that late at night right before they go to bed. I usually get some interesting answers. All right, thank you guys. Thank you all for your time. Now we're up to the consent agenda. And it's on the next page. So is there a motion? Oh, actually, yeah, is there a motion? Trustee Ozuna.
Madam Chair, I appreciate the 3 new principals that stuck around for this. It's my pleasure to make a motion that we approve the consent agenda.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries 5-0. All right. Congratulations. Thank you, guys. Thank you all. We just had you stick around so we could have more people with us for a little while longer. All right, the next item up on the agenda for the board is to go into executive session, and we will need a motion to do this as well as a roll call vote. So is there a motion? Trustee Kloppenstein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Per Idaho Code 742061A, to consider hiring a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent wherein the respective qualities of individuals are to be evaluated in order to fill a particular vacancy or need. This paragraph does not apply to filling a vacancy in an elective office or deliberations about staffing needs in general.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second, Madam Chair.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded that the board go into executive session as moved. For a roll call vote, Trustee Buffy? Aye. Trustee Kloppenstein?
Aye.
Trustee Kofelt?
Aye.
Trustee Ozuna?
Aye.
And the chair votes aye. All those in favor, please say aye. Or all those, motion carries. Thank you. You guys are distracting me. Motion carries 5-0. And the board will move into executive session. Thank you. All right, the board is back from executive session at 7:48 p.m. And that moves us into item F on the agenda, potential action for executive session and superintendent candidates. So I'll open up the floor for any motions. Seeing none, we'll move on to item G, discussion. Mr. Gillen, you're up for Budget 101. Do we have a manual? Syllabus? Also, please provide homework to Trustee Kofelt.
Good evening again, Madam Chair, Trustees, Superintendent. So when I thought about Budget 101, I spent some time trying to think about what it is that would be good information to know and how do I try to convey school finance in a way that is relatively easy to understand. So I'm going to really try my best. There are some things that, for those of you who have experience in education finance or even just know budgets, that will be relatively simple. And then there's going to be some things that we're going to kind of work our way through, and then feel free to ask questions as we kind of work through the budget. I get a little bit excited to talk about the budget, I'll be honest. You know, opportunities to really learn about our budget. I look at our budget as really, this is the financial side of how we help kids. And so that's part of the reason I came here. It's part of the reason that I love what we do. So what is it we're going to cover? We're going to talk a little bit about fund accounting. I'm going to try not to bore you with accounting jargon. So we're going to learn a little bit. So there's going to be a couple things where we're going to talk about it, and then we'll be able to step away from it. We're going to talk about how the district earns income, how we generate our revenues, what are the drivers of those revenues. We're going to learn some terminology. A lot of things will be things that then, when I start to present the budget next month, that will kind of start to make a little more sense and you'll know what's coming. Then we'll spend some time talking about expenditures, just kind of walking through how we spend our dollars, what it is we use. We'll talk about some financial metrics, some statistics. I'll give you some questions to ask. So as part of just things that if I was a board member, or as I even sit on other boards, things that I think about when they present the budget, what things do I want to know? So I'll give you some insights into maybe things that you would want to ask questions about, and then this will also help me to make sure I have answers for them for you next month when we talk about them. And then I'll give you a little bit of intro into the budget process and what you should expect. So fund accounting. So I only once decided that I would reference accounting jargon. So I put it in italics because you will know, man, that is just like accounting stuff, right? So what is a fund? It's an accounting entity with a self-balancing set of accounts. Well, what does that really mean? So really, when you think about a fund is really its own little entity. And so for many of you who work in public business, right, you may have a corporate shell and you may have a big entity and you have subsidiaries. Funds work much the same way. It's its own little business entity. And so when we talk about funds, we're going to talk about usually specific revenues that are generated or specific expenditures that are incurred. So you can almost think about it like its own little business, its own little piece of how the organization fits together. So for some context, we have 53 funds, so that the Accounting and Finance Office will manage. And within that, we have what we call activities. And we have roughly 400 of those, when I went through the list, that are active in some way, shape, or form. And so activities are components of a fund. So within a fund, we may have multiple activities. So those are things within the fund that we've decided to delineate out separately and account for. And so that's the work that we do in our office to make sure that we can manage expenses correctly. So some examples of funds. So we have the general fund, special revenue funds, capital projects funds, debt service funds, and agency funds. The general fund is what you would think of when you think of the district. So when someone sits on the outside and they think, how does a school district spend their dollars? That's probably, for the most part, things that happen in the general fund. That's where we have most of our educational expenses. That's where we have most of our state-funded revenues, all flow into the general fund. It's basically built to identify the general operations of the district. Special revenue funds. So those are funds that generate income or have expenses that are specific as to purpose. And so we'll go through some examples, but some things to think about is the district receives IT funding. And so that comes to a special revenue fund. It's a specific calculation, it's a specific revenue stream, and it usually has specific qualifying expenditures. Capital projects funds. Those are where we do our facility construction. So those are usually for Owyhee High School. When we're doing that construction, that'll be in a capital projects fund. Plant facility levy is in a capital projects fund. Lottery dollars are capital projects funds. Debt service funds. That one's really easy when you hear about that one. That's where we pay our debt service. So that one includes the levy dollars that we'll generate based on the L2 form that you will approve in September, and that includes the debt service expenditures that we incur. And then we have agency funds. And these are dollars that we hold on behalf of other entities. So for us, agency funds are the dollars that we have accounted for in our ASB, and that's with our schools. And so those show in our financial statements as agency funds, but essentially that's dollars that are accounted for at the school level that we incorporate into the financial statements for the district. And so why do you need to know this, right? So on a lot of these slides, that's the question we're going to come back to. Why is this helpful? And so for this, the context of understanding what the fund is will help you better understand the budget that's going to happen to it. So in particular, questions?
No, I actually just wanted to, I didn't mean for you to stop.
Oh,
I
okay.
apologize. I just wanted to know if you wanted to have the board ask you questions as you go, or if you wanted to save them all for the end.
Madam Chair and trustees, I'm cool with being casual, so if you just want to feel free to ask questions as we go along, that'll help with the context of the conversation if that works for you guys.
Let's do that. Let's
Okay.
be a little more casual. And I think Jonathan clearly is really good about when your mic lights up, he stops. so I'm comfortable if you want to, like, we're kind of treat this like a work session, even though we're on the dais, and just ask questions. You do have to use the mic for the video, though. So.
Perfect. Thank you. So why do we need to know about the different funds? It will give you context for when we work through the budget. In particular, when we talk about special revenue funds and capital projects funds and debt service funds. Specifically, when I talk about we're going to transition and we're going to have conversations about special revenue funds, that'll help you understand, if you understand a special revenue fund, oh, that's a special purpose revenue. So that's revenue generated for a specific purpose, probably also has expenses associated with a specific purpose. So you can kind of get a little bit of context for how the conversation's going to go, what it is I'll be presenting. All right, so let's start with revenues. So really what I wanted to do here was just kind of talk about some inputs and give you some terminology. And so these are a lot of terms that we'll use as part of the budget process. And so I wanted to kind of give you a little bit of heads up of how they work, and then we'll get into how that actually affects the calculations. And so the first one is enrollment. So we talk during the budget process about enrollment. Enrollment actually doesn't drive funding as much as you would think it would. But enrollment does give you context for how our funding may change and how our expenses will change. So when we talk about enrollment, we typically talk about an increase in students, or in this case, this past year, a reduction in our student count. And so that reduction or increase gives you some context for what you should see in the rest of the budget process. So if I were to come and say, we're projecting enrollment increase of 600 students next year, that would give you some context for, oh, are we going to be talking about extra FTE? What other additional revenues would be coming in? What things should I be looking for as we start working through the budget process? Next is support units, and so that's a calculation that really drives our enrollment. We're going to spend some time talking about how that is calculated and what it does and how it impacts our enrollment and our revenues and our budget as a whole. And then ADA, average daily attendance. And so that's really the first figure where we start talking about how we generate income and how we get state funding, is based on our attendance and how that impacts our revenue streams. Other things that are key inputs, we're going to talk about experience for our teachers and our administrators, and that specifically will come into play when we talk about salary-based apportionment. We're going to walk through that calculation. We're going to walk through it at a pretty high level, and then we're going to dig in a little bit into the actual calculation so you can kind of get some context for how it works. And then lastly, there's ridership. That one, as you might anticipate, is focused on our transportation, and that's how we receive funding for that. Outside the general fund, we have some other inputs. So we talk about market value. We kind of just had that conversation with the bond conversation and how that impacts both debt service and our levy rate. Talk about number of FTE, some of those special revenue funds, remember, specific as to purpose for revenues and specific to expenses. a lot of those calculations associated with those are based on our number of FTE. So when we talk about we generate income from leadership premiums, well, that is based on the number of eligible FTE we have. And then some of the other special revenue funds have things such as identified students. That's usually in title or IDEA, where we talk about our student count and how that affects our revenues. So what's a support unit? Support unit is really the foundational aspect of how we get our funding. And so you got to start here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of walk through how we get to the calculation of support units. And so the first thing is you have to look at our enrollment. And then really from enrollment, you work to average daily attendance. So that's how often the student was attending every day. And so what we do is we'll walk through that calculation. We submit data to the state showing what our attendance is, and then the state actually is able to work through a calculation for our average daily attendance. So that's really step one. We get that number. When you calculate a support unit, it's not just average daily attendance. Then you take the average daily attendance and you break it down based on what grade level students are in. So I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at some of the documents that were sent over in advance, but based on the grade the student is in, drives a different divisor to calculate a support unit. And the expectation is based on different grade levels. We have a different dollar amount expectation of what it would cost to provide instruction. So we talk about divisors like kindergarten is at 40, or first through third grade is at 20. So you take your ADA for your kids that are in first through third grade, and let's say that's 100. It's much larger than that, but we'll make it nice and easy, right? And we'll say it's 100. Then you take that number and you apply your divisor, which for 1 through 3 is 20, and you would get 5 support units. So nice, easy math. That support unit is going to be the base for how we're going to get our calculations, where our revenues are going to drive from, and you're going to see that in a little bit. I had listed on here, oh, sorry, trustee.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If that calculation is the same in every district?
Madam Chair and trustees, no. Because some of it is based on the size of your district, on what divisor is used. So some of the divisors do change. If you're a very small district, you have different divisor numbers that'll be used.
Okay.
So I referred really the divisors that affect us, because we're in the larger side. But if you are a smaller side, there is some, I guess, benefits attributed to being a smaller district because you have inherent fixed costs that are just part of providing instruction that'll be based on your divisor as well.
Okay, because that's how we get less funding per student than every other, or most every other district is that's the divisor piece of that formula.
Madam Chair, yes, and other things, which I think I'll kind of work my way through as well. That'll impact our. But great question, because we're going to get to that. Also on this slide, I really talked about support unit protection. I brought that up. I realized that was a bad choice on my part. We're not really going to have much of a conversation about that. That's budget 201. So if you really get excited about this first one, we can spend a lot of time talking about protection. We're going to kind of ignore that for tonight. Just know that there is protection. The way it works is essentially if your enrollment drops, if your support units fall, there's some protections that are built in. For the most part, West Ada hasn't had to utilize that protection except for during this year. So now we've calculated a support unit. We kind of have a little bit of a feeling for how it works. Now, how do we get revenues out of that, right? So just know that the support unit factor, so we can calculate an average of how much a support unit generates for us. It's roughly $105,000. That will change every year. And so as you would anticipate, right, it will change some based on state appropriation. And as those go up, we would anticipate an increase. But it will also change based on the makeup of our staff. And so how it is that our teachers and their education level. And so it will be very specific to district. So when we talk about a support unit calculation and say it's approximately $105,000 at West Ada, that doesn't mean Boise's is $105,000, and it doesn't mean Nampa's is $105,000. So that's our calculation, our number. And so I'll kind of walk through how that works. So in the support unit, there's a couple of different factors that basically make up that calculation. First one is transportation. So that has its own funding formula. So I wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time on that tonight, but essentially it's based on ridership, and then it also looks at the dollars that we spend, the number of miles we run our buses, and the number of students who ride them. So just know that there's a component of a block grant that it utilizes our support unit calculation, And then it also is a component of just purely providing operations and how we compare with our operations with districts across the state. So it's quite an extensive spreadsheet. If you ever want to take a look at it, I'd love to share it. But so salary-based apportionment. And this is a substantial chunk of the funding that we get. So I thought I'd start with just a little bit about what is salary-based apportionment. So Idaho, this is the component of Idaho's funding formula that is essentially consumption-based. So it's based a little bit on the staff we hire and the expenses we incur. And so I want you to think about it from that perspective. When we talked about a support unit, remember we walked through that and calculation, and we said it's average daily attendance, and then we have a unit divisor and we get to a number. When you think about support units, it doesn't work exactly this way, but I guess I want you to think about it. Let's think about it a little bit like a classroom. So it's not as easy. You can't walk down to Renaissance and walk into a classroom and say that's one support unit over there and that's another support unit over there. The math just doesn't work that way. It'd be great if it did. It would be a lot easier, but it doesn't. So when you get a support unit, there are a couple things that come with a support unit. And so you get what's called a staffing allotment. And so that support unit gives you the ability to be able to receive funding associated with staffing that you're going to hire. So when we talk about getting a support unit gives us roughly 1.1 pupil service and instructional staff. So let's think about that. When we have a classroom of kids, what's the first thing we need in that classroom? We need a teacher. And so the support unit calculation and the salary-based apportionment gives us a factor to say, okay, you should be able to have a teacher. And then we've got a little bit more. We need some pupil service staff. So those are our counselors, and those are our other certificated staff that help support our students, right? And so we get, it's actually 0.079 if you really want to dig deep into the calculations of how it works, but we get an allotment for those staff as well. And then for each support unit, we get 0.075 administrators. That's a staffing allotment. And so obviously you can't hire 0.075 administrators, but when you cobble together some support units, right, that's how we're able to receive funding to be able to have a principal in our buildings and be able to receive funding for that. And then you receive 0.375 classified staff. So you cobble a couple support units together, and now we're able to have our classified staff, our secretaries and our custodians, our IT techs that are helping out in our buildings. So when you calculate salary-based apportionment, what that is basically saying is, in a nutshell, salary-based apportionment is the dollars that the district is going to receive for staff they have that are eligible. So eligible staff based on that little walkthrough I just gave you. And we're going to receive dollars to be able to pay salaries associated with those. That's the high level. If only it was that easy, it'd be great. But now we're going to walk through how it actually works, right? So as we take our support units, right, and we know that it kind of allocates us some staff, and we know what we can get, then we have to get to the revenues, right? How do we get to how we actually get our funding for that? And so you take those support units and you times it by that factor, and then you times it by a salary allotment. And that's what gets appropriated and changed every year. So we're going to start with the easy one. We're going to start with our classified staff. So remember, a support unit gets us 0.375 classified staff, and then you multiply that by a salary factor, which is $23,216. That's how we get our funding. That's then the dollar amount that gets, and then you times that by the support units. So if you have 1,000 support units, you're going to have a certain number of staff that you'll be allocated, times by that factor, that salary factor. And what I want you to think about is the salary factor is it's not a reimbursement. So it's not we paid $1 and we got $1. It's we pay $1 and we receive revenues of a different dollar amount. And so in the case of classified staff, that's usually lower on the revenue side than what we expend out. And so that's why we look for other funding streams to be able to cover that gap. So classified's the easy one. Now we're going to walk through what it means when we have administrator. So remember how I talked about that the dollar amount changes annually, and some of it is impacted based on teacher experience and administrator experience. So in this case, the calculation for administrator works relatively the same, but we're going to add a new factor. We're going to add basically an experience factor, the experience index. So we get our allotment for staff, and then we have a dollar amount for administrators. It's $38,000. And then we multiply that by an index. Then it calculates how much we get. And so that index, if you're ever wondering, is like 1.88 around for us. Sometimes it's 1.9. It changes a little bit with the staffing makeup. And so that's how we get administrative funding. And now then we go to instructional. So as you notice, I worked backwards, right? I started with the easy one. We're getting progressively more difficult, right? So now with the pupil service and instructional staff, we have a slightly different calculation. So we'll calculate that factor. We'll look into the number of staffing. And then what we'll do is we'll actually calculate that based on an average salary of where our certificated staff are placed on the career ladder. And so that's statutory provision that provides us funding associated with our teacher experience. And so that will be another calculation that we'll go out and we'll look at, and we do in our office. We prepare based on where we think people will be on the career ladder, and then that dollar amount is calculated. How you feeling so far, right? Learn it. Oh. Trustee Ed Kloffenstein.
Thank you. I was just wondering, a real quick question. I know last year, the year before, you had lots of work to do in the legislature. In terms of the evolution of this process, has it gotten more complicated or less? And is it more representational of the actual need, or you see more, or is it just the complication is trying to maybe draw funds away from education? I mean, I guess kind of curious what your perspective is.
Madam Chair, trustees, so great question. So I'll answer it from a personal perspective, and then from me personally, from working in other states, when I first came to Idaho, it was a little confusing to pick up. You know, a lot of the other states I operated in were very enrollment-based, which is another type of funding model that in other states is more prevalent. And so, but what I found as I started to work with the funding model is there, in particular, when we talk about salary-based apportionment, there are some inherent advantages that don't show up in other funding models. And so while, yes, it is complicated, once you use it a little bit, it gets like anything else. You start to get used to it. But what it does really well is we make decisions based on what is the best teacher for our kids. And so regardless of what is in the budget, right? Where in other states, when you're enrollment-based funding, that sometimes is the driver. I can tell you from operating in Minnesota and Utah, when you'd operate through the budget, at some point you kind of got to where you were like, this is the dollars we have left. And so that kind of drives a little bit of who we hire, right? We're here, we really look at what is the best teacher for our students. And so that might be a new teacher. It might be a teacher with a lot of experience. And then the funding follows. And so from my perspective, what I love about it is that we make the decisions that are best for the students, and finance doesn't have to necessarily be making decisions based on what's best for the budget. Does it make it any easier to calculate? No. As you can see, there's lots of complications with it. But once you use it and understand it, I really think that it works really well for the way funding works in Idaho. And so.
Jonathan, before you go off salary-based apportionment, I was just doing a little math on the calculator here, just to see what is the salary that we get funded at for instructional staff. So if we were at 38,500 for an average base, and our index is 1.88, one support unit has a factor of 1.1 in it for the instructional staff? Or what's the factor piece?
Madam Chair and trustees, so that's a mix of a couple of formulas.
Okay.
So when we talk about for instructional staff that are on the career ladder, we'll use the 1.1 factor, and you'll take your support units and you'll multiply it by 1.1, and that gives you your staff allowance. And then you'll multiply that by the average salary as calculated through the career ladder. And so I wish I had that number right in front of me, but I don't.
Okay.
And so then that calculation, that average, will then reach over to a calculation of what our budgeted revenues are. And I can follow up.
Yeah, I was just curious if we boil it down to, if we think about a support unit has 1.1 instructional staff in it, what are we actually getting funded for that position? Just in general context, based on our average base salary, just breaking it down to one support unit, what is the different funding amounts we're getting in there? Because it seems like when we put that index on there, that seems like a pretty good dollar amount. But I want to make sure that I understand it right.
Yeah, and so what I can do is follow up with some things. It's a little easier to see it, right? And so maybe what I can do, if there's still some interest, is that I could actually like provide for you how the calculation actually works, and you can kind of see the dollar amounts and see, because you also have to think about the revenue side doesn't necessarily compare with what the salary schedule looks like. So you have the whole other side of the calculation. The career ladder is derived off of a revenue allocation. And so it will provide how much we're going to get for funding. It doesn't always drive how much you're going to spend to bring those staff in. So yeah, so I definitely, again, I love talking about budget. So any chance we have to. So other things to walk through, benefit apportionment. This is the easy part. So 19.59% is what we receive. Basically covers FICA, Medicare, and PERSI. And then you have a discretionary. Oh.
Where are all of the other benefits covered?
Madam Chair and trustees, so a large extent of those other benefits are insurance costs, right? That actually comes from our discretionary allotment. And so the last dollar amount is our discretionary allocation, and that goes for the other expenses that we receive state funding for. And those are the not as exciting things like lights and the power bill and making sure you have supplies. And so that allocation, usually there's a portion of it that'll be allocated for insurance costs. It's not required to be spent that way. It's just in some intent language. And then there's the allocation for the other costs that you would think of when you operate an organization. Oh, see, I got too excited, right? So again, now we're going to walk back to, so that's a lot of calculations. What do you need to know? Or what would be my advice of things you'd want to know? We can obviously always dig into the calculations, but I think just understanding that our support unit number changes, that our support unit factor is necessarily not the same across districts, right? Because again, it's made up based on our teacher experience and our administrator experience, and just knowing that there's those factors in. And so when you see a change in our support unit dollar amount, you can say, oh, maybe it's a change in our experience rating with our teachers, or maybe it's a change in the makeup of our staff. And so knowing that those are different, that it's not going to be just one size fits all. This is where you get to take a little break, right? These ones don't have any really exciting calculations in it, so you can kind of let your mind rest a little bit. So other revenues in the general fund. So we have a supplemental levy, $14 million that will come in. That'll be part of the L2 certification process that you get the opportunity to be involved in September. We also receive some tort levy funding. It helps offset the costs associated with insurance. We generate income on investments. So pre-COVID, you would probably assume we could get around about $1 million every year that we generate. So we invest in the local government investment pool. So all of our dollars outside of what's kept in our checking account go to that, and then the state treasurer invests those in allowable investments that meet Idaho code. I can tell you during COVID, for the same reasons that interest rates are dropping, and that helps us when we choose to do a refunding, it's also the same reason that we're not generating as much investment income. Treasuries are not paying as well as they used to, bonds are not paying as well as they used to, so our income is essentially getting cut in half. So that's just something that we continue to manage and monitor. Other revenues in the general fund, we generate some rental income associated with people who want to use our buildings, and then we usually have some other income of a couple $100,000 just through things that happen during the year. Okay, so that's the end of the general fund. So now we get on to the special revenue funds. And so I tried to come up with a list of pretty much the prominent ones that we're going to talk about during the budget process. And so a lot of these different items all have their own calculation. We're not going to walk through all of them, so don't get too scared. I just want you to know that they're all different. But what I did want you to know is that they are all different, and that part of our work that we do as part of the budget process is to work through those calculations in conjunction with the State Department. So I kind of just wanted to walk through what are some of these dollars and how do we use them. So classroom technology is a dollar amount that we receive allocation for and we're able to use for, just like it says, classroom technology. So that might be devices. It's dollars that Devin is able to utilize to meet needs. So for example, that is calculated based on ADA. So we talked a little bit about average daily attendance. What we'll do is we'll take an average daily attendance for the district and we'll multiply that by a factor And then that factor will be applied and we'll calculate a dollar amount from it. If you ever are so inclined, there actually is a list of all the calculations out there. I can send it to you if you want some light reading. You can feel free to walk through that. IT staffing will work much the same way. Again, an ADA calculation times by a factor. A lot of these professional development, that'll be based on our eligible FTE. So I talked a little bit about how number of FTE could impact our funding. Those are dollars that we use for professional development funds. Content and curriculum, literacy funding. I talked a little about sometimes it's students that are identified, so that is based on test scores. So yet another calculation that's multiplied by a factor. And so again, all of this is information that we'll drive during the budget process. College and career advisors, we get to settle back on ADA and use that for a calculation. Lottery funding, so that is based on an ADA times by a multiplier, and then it's also based on how much is in the fund, so how much that people are using the lottery, right? And so any changes in those obviously change the impact of the dollar amount we're going to receive multiplied by the ADA that we have. Bond levy equalization, there's another 201 that I should have pulled off. I was thinking about it when I was looking at it and said, oh, I should not have talked about that. Just so you know, that calculation, those are dollars we receive to help offset interest costs. So interest on our debt. It has a calculation that includes your relative wealth, so I won't go into that one, but if you ever want to, we can have a 201 conversation another time. Safe and drug-free schools, again, we're looking at ADA, and leadership premiums are FTE. So all of these are dollar amounts that we receive that help the district do the operations, again, in a special revenue fund, right? So we talk about a specific calculation, a specific way we generate those revenues, and a lot of them have specific rules associated with how we spend those dollars. And so we account for them separately within our funds. So again, what should we know? You should know that we're going to talk about a lot of special revenue funds when we talk about the budget. We're going to spend some time talking about how those revenues are generated, and we're also going to talk about how they changed. And so in particular, you're going to see that some of these, when we have conversations about the budget process, some of them were impacted by reductions in enrollment, and some of them were impacted by changes in state appropriation. And so we'll be able to walk through that in May. So other special revenue funds. Debt service revenues that we receive associated with debt service will go in a debt service fund. They'll be utilized to pay down debt. CTE funding, those have their own calculations, usually associated with either FTE or students that are enrolled. We have some federal revenues. So again, when we talk about title and IDEA, we'll run some calculations and projections of where it is we think we're going to be as far as identified students and child count and how we'll be providing services, and then how that will impact our funding. USDA is much the same. That's obviously for food service, and so that's driven off of meals. So again, yet another calculation that we're looking at, all of these that will impact the budget. And then we have some other local revenues that we'll walk through, such as, and then tuition kindergarten is another one. So we have half-day kindergarten, and if people would like full day, it was 85% of salaries. Now we're hovering around 55%, right? So really what causes that swing? Well, two major factors, right? Our debt service fund, that's going to start to skew results a little bit, and in this case, our capital projects fund. See, that's $74 million. A lot of those are dollars associated with Owyhee High School and Pleasant View and all the things associated with the bond. And so what's good to think about here is when we talk about expenses and say what percentage do you spend on salaries? And so my answer would be, well, do you want to talk about all funds, or do you want to talk about the general fund? For the most part, people want to talk about the general fund because that's the general operations of the district, and they kind of understand how that works. But just see that the budget is different once you start to add the other funds, and comparability becomes different as well.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
Can you go back between those two slides for a second? So we have about 20 million in salary funding that comes from other fund sources, though, right?
Madam Chair and trustees, yes. It's not that there's not salaries in those, it's just going to be a substantially less percentage. The special revenue funds will have salaries in them. Said 430 million was all of our expenses. This picture doesn't actually include fund balance. And so that's why what you'll see here with the metrics also include our fund balance, since that's a budgeted amount. Staff information, we have approximately 4,500 staff of varying degrees of FTE, 2,500 plus instructional and people service staff. Enrollment and support units. So we talked a little bit about what a support unit was, right? So now we're going to talk about a number. So 1,915 support units based on enrollment. So when I talked earlier, right, I said we don't get paid based on enrollment. But this year we do. And so that's a little bit of a difference. So there was a temporary rule that was applied this year, basically in response to the COVID environment and the ability to keep attendance. So you'll see it this year in enrollment, and then you'll see a shift next year back to ADA, so to a more standard calculation we're used to seeing. What that could mean, and what it probably will mean, I'll give you a little teaser of what you're going to see during the budget process, is that even though our enrollment is going to go up, our support units might actually go down. And so because of the way the calculation's going to work. And so rather than having a student be equal to 1, a student now based on attendance will get a little bit less for each of those kids, right? So now that our enrollment will climb, but we'll actually receive a little bit less funding. And so that'll be just something that we'll walk through as part of the budget process. Enrollment this year is down roughly 2,200 students. Those are numbers you've seen before. And a metric for us is at least we sit at right around 12% of the overall state funding for education. So for our general fund, I wouldn't necessarily use that metric for every special revenue fund. Those calculations are very different. But in the general fund, if you were to look and say, we got X amount of dollars that came to schools and you applied 12%, it would be a pretty good rough calculation of what it is the dollars will receive.
Can I ask a question around the 520 million? Why is our fund balance in the budget? Like, that's what that's like kind of me mixing apples and oranges. So help me understand that.
Madam Chair and trustees, I wish I had a really good answer for that other than you budget it, because I think it's easier to think about on the revenue side. It's a revenue source. And so having fund balance, having savings are revenues that then you have available to spend. And so then on the same token, when you have it on the expense side, it's really revenues this is going to sound wrong, revenues you want to save. And so you have to pick it up on the other end, or what could happen. So if you budgeted all of your revenues in fund balance and put it in revenues and you didn't budget the expenses, you could actually inadvertently spend down fund balance when you wouldn't want to. And so that's why you also will commonly have either a dollar amount in the expense side that'll be a projected number you want to hit. So when you talk about fund balance, right, it's an ever-changing number. It's a little difficult even to calculate even as you work through the year, but usually you'll budget kind of like your floor, a number that you say, I don't want to fall below this number, and so that will show on the expense side. Often there'll be offsets in revenues and expenses. Sometimes they're not, in the case if you want to be able to utilize some of your fund balance in a given year.
Yeah, I think where I'm struggling with that concept is it's sort of like budgeting your savings and your spending every year, and then and so conceptually I'm struggling with it, especially because it's different than the way the state handles their fund balance. So they have the fund balance and then they take draws off of it and put that into their budget every year. So is there a reason why we don't do that?
Madam Chair and trustees, I think you could kind of think about it the same way. We'll just put it in the budget. So if we budget our whole fund balance, so let's say the number's 10 million. Our number's actually closer to 36, 39. Yeah. So, and then taking a draw against it would be if you didn't budget all of it on the expense side. So let's say you said that my number is 39 million, but at the end I want to have 30. Essentially, you're looking to take a draw of 9. It's not over here in another fund. It's not in like a reserve fund or a savings rainy day fund. It's really put all into the general fund. And that's really because the GASB requirements state that we do that. So you kind of start with the premise of I have to, and then you start working through, okay, how do I show that in a way that hopefully makes it as easy to understand as possible.
So we don't ever invest our fund balance in anything?
Madam Chair and trustees, so fund balance, these are great questions. So fund balance is not always cash. So we have to think about fund balance a little differently. Sometimes it is cash, right? It's just straight savings we have in the bank. But fund balance is really an accounting calculation. And so I told you I wouldn't dig too much into accounting, but we'll go there a little bit, right? So fund balance is essentially the net of our revenues and our expenses. So and the residual that we have, and that residual actually grows over time or shrinks, but we'll say it grows over time. And so that dollar amount is savings that we have in our budget, and it's savings between revenues and expenses. Usually it equates to cash, but you could also think of it as not just cash. And so, but do we invest our residual cash? Absolutely. So outside of the cash that we need for cash handling and cash management on a daily basis in the district, I said the rest of it's sitting at the pool. Some of that in the LGIP is fund balance per se. It's just not really accounted for it that way. I don't say we have $2 million of fund balance in the LGIP pool. We have the cash, and then the fund balance is the residual of the accounting. Sorry, that was very accounting-esque. I really try not to do that.
That's my background. You're up.
So we've talked about fund balance. So those are the numbers for you, just for your in policy. So questions to ask. So as we start rolling into the budget, you're going to see a lot of numbers, right? And some of the calculations are going to be new. Hopefully this helped with kind of giving you some context. But again, there's going to be a lot of things where you're like, how do we help make this a little bit more manageable, right? I mean, I live in this world every day. I love it. I get the opportunity to do great things for kids, but it's a lot of numbers all day long. And you don't necessarily live in those numbers all day. So what are some questions as a board member that you could think, well, here's some things, how do I ask, how do I start getting at it? What does enrollment look like? And so, that's the first context conversation. Remember we talked about enrollment. It doesn't necessarily drive funding, but it does give us some context for what we're going to see in the budget. That's a good question to ask. And how do we come up with that? Like, right, are there, part of our efforts is we look to project enrollment as we take a look at whether charter schools are opening in the district, right? And is that going to have an impact on our enrollment and maybe our increase? Are we looking to add FTE in the general fund, right? So that's going to talk about expenses, right? And so does that have an expense impact for us? Are we using fund balance, right? So again, fund balance fluctuates. There's just naturally going to have changes in it. But are we choosing to use some? Are we applying it to a certain thing that we're going to choose? That'd be a one-time expense. Are there changes in funding streams? Trust me, we'll spend a lot of time on that. So you can ask that question, but either way, I'm going to answer it for you. We'll walk through all of the different funding streams and how they'll impact. So you'll be pretty well versed. But in particular, what impact will that have on staff and students? And then what are the major expense changes in the budget? And again, what kind of impacts do we think that will have? Some of them which are very easy to answer, some of them which are not always so easy to answer, right? All right, so budget process. And I'll be honest, this is very specific to the Budget and Finance Office, but I kind of wanted you to see what the budget process looks like for us. So it starts actually in December. So we start pretty early on. I probably even start a little bit earlier than I need to, but I kind of like to dig in and get the process started. We'll start rolling revenues. So over Christmas break, I will start trying to run some calculations of where I think enrollment might be. I'll take a look at where we projected enrollment for the current year and how it is we did on that projection. And then we'll start looking at where we think maybe funding is going to come from the appropriation level. And so I'll start just playing with numbers, essentially, starting to walk through what I think revenue projections will look like. Then in January and February, we keep working through those numbers as we start to get information back. Usually in February, you start kind of hearing some information about what it could be for appropriation. You get a chance to see the superintendent's budget. You get a chance to maybe get some information from JFAC. And then you start really looking at expenditures. And how we do it here at West Ada, at least, is we start with really what are the required expenditures we're going to incur. So we take a look at revenues and we say, are they going to go up? Are we going to have a couple extra $100,000? And then we start looking at, well, what are the things we already know are going to increase? And you'll hear me reference this a lot, the big three, right? We talk about insurance, and we talk about transportation, and we talk about staffing. And so those three are calculations we kind of already know are going to happen. And so we know that medical insurance, it's probably going to go up. And so what is that going to cost us? We have a transportation contract, and so we have already agreed price increase. And so how's that going to impact our budget? And then we start working through, are there dollars left? And that's really where then the broader budget conversations start happening. After we've identified there are dollars available, then in late February and early March, we start talking about what do we want to do with these dollars? What are things that we can do? Maybe a new program, process, adding FTE, helping solve problems. All of that is stuff we'll work through the budget. In March, we'll have a lot of budget meetings in a standard year. So there's a lot of time spent by the executive team and budget managers and directors and budget staff. So Gloria spending a lot of time meeting with people and talking about your budget and where you think and do we want to shift some dollars around. A lot of conversation happens then. Usually by March, we can finalize revenue calculations, and usually our goal is by spring break to kind of have the general fund tentatively balanced. And so Then we start working, we've kind of already have some numbers on the special revenue funds, but in early April, we go through and try to finalize all those calculations. We finalize any outstanding questions we have with revenues, and then we roll into May. And so what we do between April and May is we start preparing budget documentation. There's a lot of reporting that goes to the State Department of Education that we try to prepare in advance of the May budget workshop. And then I'll come back and give a presentation to you, and we'll start talking through the budget. And we'll look at the changes, and we'll walk through all the funds. And then ideally in June, it's approved by the board, and then we send in our information to the State Department of Education. Whew, okay. Budget 101. Are there other questions I can answer?
Yeah, so if we're looking at doing wage increases, let's say like for teachers, how does that get planned for, since it seems like everything else is fairly structured in how?
Madam Chair, Trustee Kofelt, a lot of that is driven through two processes. The dollar amount is calculated based on the change in appropriation. And remember how I talked about, when we talked about teachers, we talked about experience and where they fit on the career ladder. We'll try to run a calculation to try to identify where our staff would be next year. During the year we're going to get funding. And then on top of that, there are changes already in statutory that'll go along with the career ladder appropriation. And so we'll kind of be able to identify what our dollar amount is going to be next year. And then that dollar amount rolls into the negotiations process that we'll have with our teachers. And that's what will drive eventually the salary increases. With classified and administrative staff, it's a little less extensive. Usually we try to match the dollar amount that is provided and appropriated for. So like this year was a 2% increase. And so again, that is not all paid for from state funding. So when we do a 2% increase, it costs us a little more than 2%, on the whole, because of the difference between funding and the actual expenses. And so that difference is picked up as part of the general fund. We'll go through and calculate that, and you'll see that during the budget presentation. I'll walk through it. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're
I know. Can I run back and go grab the next PowerPoint?
Yeah, go for it.
I thought if I brought too many PowerPoints up, it would be a stack of papers. So next on the list is we're going to have an update on stimulus funding. And so, whoa.
It's okay. We're in work session. I'm just going to call it that.
So really what my thought with this is to really kind of walk through what dollars we've already received and how we use them, and then what dollars we're going to receive. And then we'll talk a little bit about some tentative plans or proposals for how to use them. We won't dig really as much into that. I think you'll kind of see as we walk through the stimulus conversation, you'll see there's still a lot of questions that we don't have all the answers for yet.
Yeah, and just for the board's sake, I think when we asked when we talked to Jonathan about this presentation, like he said, there are some things that they're proposing maybe some future funds be used for, but I think we had a good conversation about wanting to make sure that the new superintendent had input into that process. So we would, it's good for the board to know kind of where we're at today, but then we'll probably have some more conversations around that.
So stimulus dollars, again, we're going to kind of walk through the funding we have received, and specifically most of those dollars are associated with COVID relief funding. So, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is and why it's different than ESSER funding, which is another term. And then we'll walk through some of the dollar amounts. I'll walk through again how we spent those dollars. Then we'll talk a little bit about ESSER funding, what we know and don't know. And then there's other stimulus dollars coming from associated with other things, which we have some calculations for. You're going to see me use the word throughout this presentation approximately, and that's because I'm running some projections. I'm making some estimates based on information I have and information that changes all the time. And so just know that they're my estimates today, and we'll see how they pan out when we actually receive the funding. So we'll talk a little about some learning loss funding, and then again we'll reference a little bit about plans. So funding we have received. So these are going to be a little more concrete. So dollars we've received. We received funding associated with the COVID relief funding. something to think about with this. So when you receive federal dollars, depending on where it's distributed from, there are oftentimes different rules and regulations associated with the funding. And so a lot of the COVID relief funding actually came from Treasury, which is a little different for school districts. And so they had some different rules and regulations. And later on, we'll talk about kind of how, at least my process, to ensure that we spend the dollars on allowable things and make sure that we're in alignment with our auditors and with the State Department and the governor's office and make sure that we're using the dollars effectively. So what you'll see is there's some dollars here that we again received from Treasury. We received distance and blended learning money. We received learning management system funding, some social emotional dollars. USDA did receive some funding, and then CRF funding, which was a larger dollar amount. So how did we use the dollars? So the distance and blended learning money, we purchased devices. So that one is pretty easy. Learning management system funding, we offset costs associated with our LMS, Microsoft Teams. You're going to see a little later on, we also purchased some other learning management systems, and so you'll see that, that we use CRF funding for that. Social emotional learning dollars, so this was specific again as to purpose, and so you can see we've done some allocations out to elementary schools so they can spend some dollars, and then at secondary level, the counseling staff are looking into the core project program. USDA funding, around July or August of last year, we received an allotment that was associated with really offsetting expenditures already incurred. And so we were able to basically apply for dollars associated and provide a list of the expenses that we incurred associated with providing food service operations and COVID, and we were able to receive reimbursement. So coronavirus relief funding, that was that larger dollar amount at the bottom. I'm going to kind of walk through some of the expenses and then talk about how we were able to utilize those dollars in other ways. So we purchased an additional LMS. So I guess I'll take a step back. COVID relief funding had some rules associated with when it was in the budget. So if it was in the budget as of, I want to say it was March 13th, then it couldn't have qualified unless if it was in the budget, and if it wasn't in the budget, then you could use it. Unless it was in the budget, but it substantially changed. And so let's say you had this dollar amount. Well, for us, a great example is nurses. So we budgeted our nursing staff with an expectation of they'd be used one way, and then it was substantially different and used another way. And so now it was able to qualify for reimbursement. So you'll see that just kind of some of the rules also drive what drives specific expenditures. So we purchased some additional LMS. Seesaw specifically used at the elementary level, and then Edgenuity was used with our virtual schoolhouse. We bought some textbooks and novels for students to be able to take home. We had some additional staff time. We allocated dollars for noon duties, so additional dollars associated with that. And then we did some curriculum development over the summer. More IT, so more devices, and then also educational, or supplies associated with those devices. So now that we have one-to-one devices, we need more power cables, and we need to think about screens that crack, and we need to think about keys that we have to replace and all of that. $497 was allocated for hotspots. We'll talk about hotspots again in the next slide, but that was essentially to get us through December, and then there will be ongoing costs after that. FFCRA leave, so that's the Family's First Coronavirus Relief Act. That was an allowable expense to allocate costs associated with that. PP&E, so I think I actually used an accounting term there where I wasn't supposed to, but so masks and desk barriers and all of those things, $635,000. We utilized some dollars to rent vans to be able to maximize our transportation. And so this allowed us to make sure that all of our bus drivers were driving buses. Vans didn't have that same necessary requirement to have CDL, and so we're able to help make bus transportation as efficient as possible as we looked at drivers. And then we provided stipends to staff, which most of you are aware of since we went through the process with negotiations and had an equivalent amount for staff. Expenses to offset the general fund. So some of the dollars, I'm thinking back, I think, Renee, you asked me this conversation when we first talked about COVID relief funding, how much was going to offset the general fund. And so we did use some dollars to offset general fund expenses. 2 of our PD days were essentially COVID related, identified as such, and so we were able to offset some general fund expenses. And then I talked a little about nursing costs. So that saved us $3.4 million. And so what did we do with those dollars? So that's how we were able to pay for hotspots from January to June. So at the time that we were looking at that costs, COVID relief funding initially ended December 30th. And so that was kind of our cutoff. It wasn't until right around December that we realized, oh, it can go a whole nother year. But by then we had basically incurred all of our costs and done our work. So we had this gap from January to June, the time we're living in right now, where we didn't know that dollar wasn't set up in the budget. The hotspots weren't an expense we were planning for. And so generating savings here now allowed us to offset the general fund and be able to expense it later without general fund impact. Math textbooks is something that came back to us quite often as a need for the district. And so generating some savings, offsetting costs allowed us to be able to get a little more flexible in the general fund to do that. The synchronous learning technology that Dr. Barrett shared and talked about with the cameras and all of the work associated with that. And then also additional desk barriers. We are still buying hand sanitizer and sanitizing wipes on a daily basis. So funding we will receive. So the first one I'm going to tell you we actually already have access to. So ESSER 1 is an allocation that we received and was actually put in the budget for this year. $3.1 million. It came in pretty late during the budget process last year. And so as of right now, we have expended $1 million of that. We've incurred those costs. So what you're going to start to see is you're going to start to see a lot of conversation about dates. And actually, let's back up a little bit. ESSER funding comes to us through the Department of Education. So now we're talking about a different set of rules. You all have on your desk a list of allowable expenses. When we get to that slide, that'll give you a little bit of context for kind of the steps we walk through. So ESSER 1 is allocable until September of 2022. So that's how long we have. That's our period of performance. And that is in our budget. Now we talk about ESSER 2. And that was an allocation that we should receive. Numbers are looking at $13.9 million. And then we just received word last week that the State Board of Education will be providing us allocating out $2.3 million out of their set-aside funding. And so that's an allocation they have. The reason why they did that, we'll kind of talk a little about when we talk about ESSER 2 usage, but it was specifically to offset a loss in discretionary funding that we received this year as well, and we'll talk a little about that with uses. As of right now, we haven't incurred any costs in ESSER 2, and primarily, it's because the funds are not available to us. So once they're appropriated, then we'll be able to have access to be able to do draws against them, but they haven't been appropriated yet, and so that really at the state level, and so that also doesn't allow us to be able to draw the funding against it. So, and that's just a timing difference. It'll come in and we'll be able to access it. We have time ahead. I mean, part of the audit process is going through and doing all these reconciliations and identifying expenses, and that process goes until August for us, even though we close the year at June 30. ESSER 2, expended by 2023. All right, ESSER 3. So now we go with the next funding stream. So distribution will be approximately $31 million, and again, I'm using that word approximately, right? We have some information that talks about allocation, but hasn't been finalized as of yet. 20% will be required to be utilized for learning loss. So a slight change from ESSER 1 and ESSER 2. I copied the bill language, so it's not a really exciting read, but it does give you a little bit of context for what we talk about when we talk about learning loss. The other 80% will be available for uses similar to ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 with some modifications. There are some changes to facility things, and I believe it's item number 3 on the ESSER 2 list was removed. But substantially, they're the same. No timetable yet for when funds will be dispersed to districts, and ESSER 2 or ESSER 3 has an expend by September of 2024 deadline with the possibility of 2025. The state of Idaho has to request an extension with the State Department, with the the Federal Department of Education. Other stimulus funding. So we were notified that there's an allotment associated with IDEA Part B funding. That was in ESSER 3 or the ARPA. And so it'll be 20% of our current allotment. I'm anticipating that to be around $1.25 million. This is relatively new. There's not a whole lot of information coming out. We've received some, but nothing that really identifies a dollar amount. So I just ran some approximate calculations. Those dollars won't be available until next year anyway. And so we would receive a award letter that would anticipate around the same time we would typically see special education funding. And so we have no real dates yet on how long that can be expended for, the period of performance, how long we're going to be able to use it. So it could be just next year only. It could have 2 years. We'll learn those as the funding streams continue to come in. And then governor's learning loss funding. So this is a separate allotment. This is coming out of COVID relief funding. So back to what we talked about before. So now we're under Treasury guidance, and we're also talking about a different date. We're talking about December of this year. And so Those are dollars that will be, there's calculations that will be ran. We know it's going to be based on April IRI scores, at least that's what I've heard recently. It'll be used for K-4 literacy, and then 25% will be allocable to other things. So we have a committee that's already working on some ideas of how to utilize those funds, and so that committee is meeting weekly as we look to identify expenses that will be eligible.
Jonathan, I want to make sure I'm understanding this. So we have 1.3 million that we're projecting will come in off of the governor's learning loss funding? Or is that the total for what the governor's allocating?
Madam Chair and trustees, that's my projection of what we'll receive.
Okay. And then we have that, we have 20% of the ESSER 3 funds for learning loss. What else is currently allocated specifically to learning loss? Are those just the two?
Madam Chair and trustees, yes, those would be the two that would have specific identification as has to be used for learning loss.
Okay.
The other 80% of ESSER funding obviously could be used for those things, so they're not going to tell you no. But specifically identified, that would be the 20% in ESSER 3 and the 1.3 million, which again, I'll caution is a projection. We should receive information from that in the next probably month.
So is the committee working on a block amount, or what are they working on in particular around? Is it just this 1.3, or is it the total, or how are we looking at that?
Madam Chair and trustees, we've had lots of conversation about all of the funding, and so I think we're gonna look at ways. We've had our first meeting where we started to walk through what some things look like, and we have a good list, and then I think we'll start looking at how we refine the dollars and make sure that we meet expenditure timeline requirements, and so what things may qualify for governor's relief funding, since we know we have to spend that by December of this year, and what we would use with the ESSER 3 funding. But essentially, I think if you want to leverage them, looking at them together allows you a better ability to maximize your impact.
Who makes up the committee? That'll be my last question.
Yeah, Madam Chair and trustees, so Dr. Reynolds is on it, Brett Heller, Dustin Barrett, Marcus Myers, myself, Dave Roberts, and Ramona Lee from special education.
Just maybe something for thought if we had some school administration on there. I don't know if we could entertain that thought.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So plans to use the funds moving forward. So before we talk about how we're going to use them, I thought I'd walk through kind of what is a plan just in general. When you get federal funding, in particular, how do we look through how we're going to utilize those dollars in an effective and just as important for us and for our annual audit allowable manner. So we will partner. We'll have lots of conversations with our external auditors. And so I think there probably hasn't been a week that's gone by that I haven't talked to our auditors as we both try to understand what the guidance looks like. And so they have access to some information I don't know. I have access to information they don't know. And so we spend time talking about what are the dollars coming in, what are the allowable uses, and really having, I'll say, great conversation about how we partner on understanding the guidance. So a lot of times the dollars come and the guidance kind of comes later. In particular for an auditor, it comes much later when they get their testing guidance. So as we look to say we're going to incur costs and then later on there's going to be guidance on what was allowable, how do we try to mirror those together so at the time we're incurring the costs, we make sure that we're trying our best to be in compliance with federal rules. So we spend a lot of time chatting, probably more than she would like to. We also identify a list. I spend a lot of time basically walking through, here's some ideas of how we would spend those dollars, and here's some ways we could use our funding. And then here's justification for why I think it aligns with allowable guidance. And then we'll have conversations about what that looks like and whether we both are interpreting the guidance the same way. And then on top of that, we're also spending federal dollars, and so there's federal procurement rules. So outside of just Idaho procurement rules, we'll also have to align with some federal rules, which are sometimes a little different than we're used to applying on a daily basis. So I think on front of you, you probably have a letter from the State Department of Ed. It's got their letterhead. Hopefully it was on your desk. Really, I'm not planning on walking through all of that. That's just a little bit of context for, hey, when we got ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 funding, here's some allowable costs, and it walks through things that can be interpreted a host of different ways, right? And so there's some things where you look and say, oh, that's HVAC funding. Yep, that makes perfect sense. Or, oh, we could use that for social emotional learning, or we could use it for special education. We can identify all of those. And then there are other things where it starts to say, well, you can use it for other needs across the district. So lines 3 and lines 15, is when you start looking at those and saying, well, there's some flexibility in there. And so I think that's when it really comes in where you start talking with your auditors about what does that flexibility look like, and are we all still applying the flexibility correctly in the same way? Because again, what we don't want to run to is a situation where we've incurred a cost, and then later on when our audit happens some 9 months later, we're both trying to remember how we interpreted that cost to be eligible, and then what does it look like now when our auditors have seen it. So, again, a lot of these costs are still the ideas that it should be tied to COVID, and then a lot of the uses will align with a lot of those categories, which, as you can see, we touched on a bunch of them. In particular, with ESSER 2 funding, the district received a reduction in our discretionary funding. So when I talked during Budget 101 and I talked about part of our support unit calculation was discretionary funding, the district received a reduction this year, and the expectation was, the thought was that we'll be able to apply our ESSER funding in a way to be able to backfill that loss. And so part of what we'll go through as ESSER 2 funding becomes available is how we'll utilize those funds to backfill the loss in discretionary in a manner that is still consistent with what's listed on that page before you. And so we'll walk through those. So we'll talk about, it can't just be, what it can't be is just I've lost $9 million in revenues and I'm just going to pop it in. And that really doesn't work. And so you have to dig a little deeper and you have to work a little harder to get to the same place. And so we'll continue to work through those. All right, so now that we've talked about allowable uses, I'm just going to give you a quick kind of walk through of how we maybe proposal, see some of the ways that we can use those funds, and a lot of it is going to be driven off of what we've ascertained are allowable uses or the needs that we may see at the district. So ESSER 1 funding, those costs can be utilized to offset virtual schoolhouse. So that is an allowable expense associated with obviously having COVID. And so the remaining $2 million will most likely at least propose to be able to be used to be able to offset those costs. When we talk about ESSER 2, and again, we talked about a loss in discretionary, right? So as we talk about looking at those lost dollars, we'll be able to, again, use virtual schoolhouse as the vehicle for the allowable expense to be able to offset the impact on the general fund. And then as we roll into next year, there's an expectation, at least as of right now, that not all of the students who left may come back. And so how do we handle that enrollment gap? And so ESSER funding will be able to allow us to be able to, do that by identifying allowable expenses and be able to cover some of that enrollment loss. And then I just put down currently there's $13.9 million dollars available. We kind of talked about that once it becomes appropriated, we'll be able to start utilizing those dollars. In the SBO set aside, part of what we were looking to utilize that for was to offset some of the one-to-one costs that Devin is incurring, which will also allow him to be able to roll into next year and have ample funding available for that one-to-one cost, specifically associated with the fact that his funding in classroom technology was reduced this year and it's anticipated to be at the same low level again next year. So essentially this will help us kind of weather that funding gap. ESSER 3 stimulus, again, that's years 21-22 through 23-24. Utilize dollars potentially to remedy the enrollment gap if that continues. And then there are a host of other things, right, that we'll start discussing as part of that committee and other groups that will get involved, right, as education intervention tools, facility and or equipment needs, education technology to assist with one-to-one, and then other items as identified, right, as we continue to work through what that looks like, what's allowable, what are the things we can do, and really what are the needs of the district and how we do our best to meet the needs of kids. Again, fund is not available as of the date of the board meeting, so we still have all $31 million available to us. Other funding allotments. So again, we talked a little about that learning loss. It's much the same. I anticipate soon we'll receive that calculation of what the dollar amount's going to be, and we'll see how good my calculation was. And then if it wasn't very good, I'll have to come here and tell you that I was off a little bit. So, but anyway, dollars we're looking to spend, it could be for things like intervention tools, education technology. The real driver of this one will be that December 30th deadline. And so that will, I think, just not necessarily drive us to expenses, but we'll change the outlook of what expenses we look at, knowing that that deadline exists. And then IDA Part B funding, much like I said, we just have initial calculations of that, so we'll start identifying potential uses for those as the dollars become available and as we get more information. So next steps. So continue to work on identifying the funding streams and allowable costs. I think you'll hear me say that for the next 2 years. So be ready. You're still going to hear it again for quite a while. In our proposed budget, so as part of once we receive those dollars available, in particular for ESSER 2, we'll be able to budget for those, and so you'll see those adjustments come in when we provide an updated budget for in June for 2021, and you're going to see that conversation in May as we talk about our proposed budget for next year. And then hopefully between now and then, perhaps the next board meeting, we'll be able to identify a little bit more structure around that stimulus funding plan and what it is you guys would like to see, so to provide guidance to us. Questions?
Any questions, comments, thoughts? Because I think guidance is also helpful, right, Jonathan?
Yes.
Okay, great, yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just had a quick question about ESSER funding. So you said that the enrollment gap will be filled by ESSER for this coming year. So it's a one-time relief, basically. Is that correct?
Madam Chair and Trustee Koffenstein, probably some of it, yes, for this year and also next year, but yes, it is one time. So we'll be utilizing federal dollars to remedy that enrollment gap with the expectation, the hope, that enrollment continues to grow. So as the dollars are spent and utilized, ideally we'll have that nice equal balancing where enrollment comes back at the same time that the stimulus dollars become spent.
Yeah, excellent. And I was just curious, roughly how much is there available for that enrollment gap in terms of dollars?
Madam Chair and Trustees, it's really a component of all of the funding streams. And so I guess if I was going to think about it less about how much is available, it's more about how much we'll need, right? And so you'll see kind of when I start to talk about the budget for next year in May, we'll have a calculation of based on what we think enrollment's going to be, based on our projection of enrollment, here's what the enrollment funding gap is, and then here's how we could utilize ESSER funding to meet that gap, should we choose to do that.
Thank you. Very helpful on all this information. Appreciate it.
No other questions? You guys processing it all? So can I clarify something? Because I think we talk about that enrollment gap, but let's talk about it in terms of people and what that really means. So that enrollment gap, if we don't solve that enrollment gap issue, what we would have to do is change our staffing for the new enrollment. So solving that enrollment gap allows us to keep some staffing levels at where we were at pre-COVID and then watch the enrollment as it comes up, which I think we all think it will at some point. We're just not sure when. It allows us to keep stability in our staffing is why we're looking at that option. Is that correct?
Madam Chair and Trustees, yes. So it'll allow us to maintain our current staffing level and basically fill that reduction in revenues. Remember, I talked about our support units would probably be going down. And so that we're staffed at a support unit level up here. Our support units will be down here. And so that gap will essentially how we'll utilize the ESSER funding to be able to offset those costs.
And we should be able to quantify that amount because we have that in your budget 201 discussion, that sort of that item that says if your enrollment drops by a certain amount, there's like a safety catch for that the state allows every district to have. So we should be able to quantify what the difference between the safety amount that the state has put in place and what our original calculations are right now, right? Yeah,
Madam Chair and Trustees, yes. So we should be able to calculate the gap between what our staffing level is at versus where our support unit's at. The one factor that is that budget 201 conversation is really when we talk about the support unit protection. So we receive protection if you fall below 3%, essentially protection starts to kick in for districts. The way that protection works is basically it's a self-funded insurance plan. And so oftentimes when you're growing, we'll pay into the plan and not utilize it. The one thing that is very difficult to calculate and would have been even more, was very difficult this year, really, as we talked in during the budget process last year, for those of you who were around, was we kind of have an idea of what that protection is for us. What we don't know is what that protection is for every other district. And since it's a self-funded insurance plan, essentially anybody else's losses, we would also pay into at least our portion of. And so that's the part that I think we'll have some information on, because we'll kind of have an understanding of where we think our enrollment projections is. And then I think we'll use that projection as a way to be able to say, this is how we think the rest of the state will work. But we'll always know, which we always kind of do associated with that, is we won't really know what that calculation is going to be, and if we have a reduction in our support units associated with paying into that self-insurance plan until like October. And so it's just, but again, it's just things you manage through and you continue to work through during the year.
So is that not the Public Education Stabilization Fund that they're using for that?
Madam Chair and trustees, no, we actually pay into it.
Okay.
So the Public Education Stabilization Fund works a little differently, and that will work if, let's say, they planned for support units of, we'll throw out a number like 1,000, that's not the actual number, and it was 1,005. Those 5 extra support units would come from the state's Public Education Stabilization Fund. In this case, when there's losses, we'll all pay into that. It would have been, I talked about this year how we were paid on enrollment. If we had been paid on ADA, it would have been a substantial loss, and that we would have paid into the fund. I can't remember the number. It was too scary actually to look at. I was just really happy we were paid on enrollment this year. But and so that's part of the number where we won't necessarily know how we are doing in relation to everybody else. And so we'll try to manage and try to gather whatever information we can, and then we'll work through that again in October when we have the conversation.
Okay. So maybe the better question is, who manages that self-funded fund we all pay into?
Madam Chair and trustees, the State Department of Education will basically identify how much is going to be paid from that insurance plan. It's not what it's called, but and so then we'll have a reduction in the support units we're paid to pay into that dollar amount. Okay. So the way it flows through in our reporting, essentially, we just see that, oh, the protection costs us on a normal year like 2 units, and so, but it could be 5, right? And so we won't start to get information on that until really we all start sending in average daily attendance data, which doesn't happen until we're into the year 30 to 45 to 60 days.
Okay. All right, great. So the only thing that I would ask for from a guidance standpoint is, as you guys come through and make recommendations on this ESSER funding, that we tie it back to our strategic objectives and our continual improvement. So that's what I was missing. I saw a lot of kind of replacement of costs, but ultimately I think we have a responsibility to also look at what happened to our students this last year and our teachers. And so it would be helpful to see that as we kind of see those presentations more from a strategic and growth and how we're managing to improve than, and I know you're the budget person, so you had to come in with the budget piece, but I'm providing that feedback now so that we can see how that plays out, because that's a lot of money. Yeah. And I'd hate for, at the end of the day, for us to just say we covered costs and we didn't know what it actually did to impact our student learning. Yeah. So,
Madam Chair and trustees, I think that's exactly what you'll see, right? We've already had that conversation. Unfortunately, what you got from me was a very budgety.
You're the budget. I get it. I get it.
Perfect. Other questions I can answer? Wonderful. Thank you.
Next time you say you're going to bring friends with you is what you're saying, right? The next item up on our agenda is just a discussion. I think Dr. Reynolds had talked to the mayor, and I've talked to him too now, around they'd like to have a joint meeting, and in May was the date that, or May was the month that was requested. And I wanted to just provide some context, because I was thinking in my mind, like, hey, we might want to have this meeting, after, if we've hired a new superintendent. But I talked to the mayor a little bit, and their council hasn't met a number of our new trustees. So they wanted to see if we could meet in May, and we can have another one later after the new superintendent is on board and has a little time maybe too. So then I think Clerk Newbold had some suggested dates, and we need to lock down a date for folks, so get your calendars out for May, and that was why we put this on discussion rather than us having a meeting outside of the board meeting. And also if you had any agenda items that you wanted to talk to with Meridian City Council.
So the dates that Mayor Simonsen's office recommended May 13th or May 17th. And when he and I visited, it was an opportunity for the city council in particular to meet the new trustees. So he was thinking it could be a very informal meeting. He didn't really talk about a intensive agenda or anything. He just thought it should be more of a casual get-together.
I'm sorry, I probably should know this, but Clerk Newell, what are our current board meeting dates in May?
Madam Chair, Trustees, the current board meeting dates are May 11th and May 25th. And I apologize, I don't have the graduations on my calendar right now.
That's okay.
For the academies.
Yep. And then we'll definitely have to have a budget conversation in May, potentially a bond conversation in May. I'm just thinking out loud so the board knows kind of.
The 25th.
Mr. Gillen, when do you actually have to have a budget decision by in June? Okay.
Historically, we've had the workshop during the 25th, and then we had a budget hearing, the first board meeting in June. We have to advertise that budget hearing.
Yeah, come on up. That's okay.
Madam Chair and trustees. So we do have to advertise that budget hearing and give that date to the county because they put it on tax notices. And so that's a date we've already given them and a date we would like to stick to. So I think that's June 8th. I'm just remembering off the top of my head. And usually we back up 2 weeks and I do the budget workshop on the 25th to kind of get you prepped for the 8th budget meeting.
So, is there any challenge with doing the budget prep on the May 11th instead of the 25th to give the board a little more time for questions and consumption this year?
Madam Chair and trustees, maybe, just because our budget actually hasn't been approved at the state level. And so in some ways, I hate to say it, I might need those 2 weeks. There have been some changes just with the COVID environment and how process has been, so I might need that extra time.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, you guys, which date would work better, the 13th or the 18th for the 17th or the 18th? 13th or 17th? Okay. Is there a preference? 13th would be 2 meetings in 1 week.
Yeah, Madam Chair, the 13th will work for me. I will not, I'm going to be out of town and would not be able to participate on the 17th.
I'm available on either day, so the 13th is fine.
Can I ask what time of the day this meeting would be held?
So the city council starts at 4:30, but we can go, last time we did it at 6, didn't we?
Yeah, so when I talked to the mayor's office, it was 5:30. They could start at 5:30. And it's our turn to host, so.
Oh, is it?
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
So they could start as early as 5:30, but we could actually set it for 6. Okay.
I'm available both days.
Yeah, I can make the time. I've got an event on the 13th, but I can move it.
Okay. Okay, well, I think that gives us, we don't actually have to set the date we want to get that. Is there anything besides meeting that you want to know from the city council in Meridian? We talked about, actually the mayor and I talked about having an update. They've hired a person last time we met with them, they had hired a person, half of their job was around managing the growth and looking at the, what's kind of their approval, like what they thought their growth was going to look like based on all of the different plats that they've been approving in new construction. So we talked about having an update on that. I don't know if that would be helpful from the board's perspective for their person. And actually, she used to work for us, I think, at one point, but that's one item. Is there anything else? And we can leave it open too, but just if there's anything we wanted to see if they wanted to be prepared to share with us.
Madam Chair, yeah, I was just, for me, it would be around the growth, and then we can see how that ties into kind of the district's anticipated growth plans.
Okay. Okay. And then is there anything that we all would like to ask staff or us to be prepared to share with them that we think would be important for us to communicate with them? And you could think on that and send Clerk Newbold and I some topics too. We don't have to decide it tonight, but think on that. I know if we ask staff to do that, it would be helpful for them to have a heads up so that they can have a little time to do that. So maybe sometime this next week, if you think of something. Trustee Ozuna.
The last time we met with the city, they were really interested in the new high school, so it might be good to give an update on where we stand with that, and maybe the traffic flow that's anticipated there when it opens and that type of thing might be helpful.
Madam Superintendent, is that how I address you? What are the options for actually, is that high school ready to even, could we have a meeting out there or tour it as part of the meeting?
I'm so sorry, I didn't understand.
Owyhee High School. Is there a potential to walk the Meridian City Council through that high school, or where is it at in the construction, or do we know? I mean, do you know? I mean, I know you would probably know, but I mean, specifically, are we still in the construction phase where we can't walk people through is what I was wondering.
We could walk people through.
Okay. That actually might be kind of fun, so let's
Yeah, I don't know that we would have any furniture there yet, but we've walked through, and they have heat now, so that's good.
We won't be freezing?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be fun.
Okay. We'll talk through that.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. And maybe the context on the traffic patterns will make more sense too. All right, great. That's a good suggestion. Thank you. Well, if you think of anything else, let us know, and we'll go from there. So, the last item up on our agenda is the superintendent search process. Just an update on that and the public forum. And I think Ms. Jackson's here to talk about the public forum. And then we also have the tour with the candidates on Monday that Clerk Newbold can talk to us about. Before we leave tonight, though, we need to get some confirmation from the trustees that everybody's going to be able to be there, or if you can't, who's not going to be there. So I'm assuming we're good on the public forums, but on the tour is the one that we had some question on. So, and then we also have the interviews on the 20th that we'll want to make sure everybody is available for. So specifically, if you have to pick around what to be available for, we need to have every trustee in those interviews. So just wanted to make, and we'll get the times are during, I think we were planning on doing those during the day, so for the candidates. So do you, Ms. Jackson, do you
Madam
want?
Chair, can I just clarify for the 20th meeting, I would just need so I could post it. I'd like to post it soon.
Okay.
I've had a lot of patrons call and ask when that's going to happen, so.
Oh, the meeting on the 20th will just be interviews. We won't make, the decision's not till the 27th.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So just the time of day I'd need.
Yeah, Yeah,
Alright.
and we'll work with ISBA on that because they're setting up the interviews.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, perfect, thank you.
Yep. So let's start off with Ms. Jackson. Why don't you update us kind of on the public forum? And this is actually the first time all of us are seeing this, so I think if there's anything in here, please provide feedback now so that because this is next Monday, so Ms. Jackson needs kind of confirmation we're good with this tonight so that all the planning can be finalized and move forward, so.
So Chair Johnson, trustees, Dr. Reynolds, so you have a hard copy of what we propose for the forums on Monday, so I won't go over that line by line. But yes, please let me know if you have feedback. We have a meeting, I know, with Madam Chair and Trustee Buffy on Friday so we can finalize.
I just have a question. We don't know how many participants we're going to get, but so 2 questions. One, our schools are in less than 6 feet distance. Do we need to keep and stay with that, or can we go to the CDC 3? And then my other question is, if we get more people than we have capacity for, we can refer them to the live link, but are we saying then they can't testify, or are we still going to give them a number and allow them an opportunity to testify by maybe coming into the building when it's their turn?
So Madam Chair, trustees, Dr. Reynolds, so I filled out an attestation form with Central District Health letting them know that we would have approximately 75 people over the course of the whole evening. So we need to stick to that based on our attestation form. So if we get to capacity and our chairs are full, they'll be 6 feet apart, then we will have to turn people away and they will be directed to the live link. But with it only being 2 hours and each candidate being able to answer the question for approximately 3 minutes, it's not going to allow, for example, 75 people to ask a question anyway.
Yeah, I think what I'm thinking is, let's say we get 150. We can only have 75 in the room, great.
Correct.
But let's say 150 are there, they want to sit in their car with their number, and if their number gets called, they can come in and ask the question. We're not going past what we filed for, but so because if we, I don't know what we'll get, but if we get more than 75, then now we're in a challenging situation of it's a first come, only the first people there, especially with the staff forum, because the staff one, some of those teachers are still going to be in class when we first start, so they can't get there early. And a lot of them won't be able to get there early, but some won't be able to get there until after we start. So maybe let's just think through that piece of it a little more.
So Madam Chair, trustees, so if I'm doing the math in my head right, there's not a possibility for 75, just using that number, questions to be asked. We won't have the time. It'll go way past 6 o'clock.
Yeah, sorry, 75 people will never, even our current time will never have that. But we could get 75 people who want to ask a question. What we're proposing here is we'll hand out 75 numbers, and we'll use a random number generator, and we'll get maybe 20. Let's just say 20 in that time frame. Well, we can do a random number generator of 150. We can do a random number generator of 250. We still will only get 20 questions. So what I'm saying is our pool of people can be as large as the people that show up. It's the random number generator will be limited by time for who gets called. So if we turn people away, we're shrinking the pool of potential options for people to ask questions. So I'm not thinking we'll ask 75 questions, but we'll hand out 75 numbers. Is that?
So if I'm understanding correctly, you just want to make sure everyone who gets a number is able to ask their question. But hypothetically, let's say the room is full, are we able to pull them in to come ask it?
Yeah, so like kind of what we did in some of the public process this year, we had folks listening in on a live link in their car, and then so let's just say I'm number 110, and the random number generator brings up 110, I actually can come in and ask my question even though I didn't get a seat in the room.
So Madam Chair, trustees, Dr. Reynolds, only those asking a question will get a number. Everyone else will just come in and sit down. So there will be some people who will come and not want to ask a question, we anticipate. So we'll let the room get to capacity with people who do want to ask questions and don't want to ask questions. If there happens to be capacity met and there's still someone who has a number, then yes, we would have a process that we can pull them in. We could have, for example, Sherry could leave the room for a moment to allow, the capacity to lessen a little bit. So I think that's something we can easily work through.
Trustee Ozuna.
Thank you. Can you walk me through the process that's going to be used for staff? Because with the staff time being 4 to 6, elementary teachers, for example, might not have the opportunity to be there at 4, and we would hate to have all of the elementary staff in the parking lot and in that kind of situation. So what is the plan there for elementary? And can they also get a number then to maybe ask questions later, although they might miss half of their opportunity for that?
Madam Chair, Trustees, Dr. Reynolds. So we'll keep handing out numbers throughout the 4 to 6 time period. We won't just hand them out at the beginning, like if you trickle in later because you can't be there right at 4, then you'll still get your number. Does that make sense?
Yes, and can I follow up? Can we make sure that we have a process that we don't fill the room with middle school and high school staff and not allow for elementary staff to get in?
Madam Chair, Trustees, Dr. Reynolds, I do not have a process for that in my head. I would have no idea how we would be able to determine that. So we can think about that. I can try to figure something out, but I don't know how I would be able to manage that. So I can sure think about that, though.
Thank you. Trustee Ozuna.
I don't know what to expect for what kind of turnout
Right.
we might have, but I do think that it's really important that we don't put some staff at a disadvantage to be able to come in and listen to the candidates.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then, actually, you know what, Ms. Jackson, why don't you walk us through kind of how it will work? I know you've got it written out here, but everybody did, I think, get this kind of right before, so why don't you walk it through kind of your vision for it?
Madam Chair, Trustees, Dr. Reynolds. So this is something that the communication team and Clerk Newbold came up with we walked through the setup of the room. So we'll have the chairs set up with 6 feet of distance, like auditorium style. Mask sanitizer is at the door. You all can be seated in the front row, and the candidates will be at a table. Then I can be at the podium and walk people through the process, welcome them and tell them a little bit about the process. So we'll have an employee at the lobby welcoming people. Clerk Newbold will be at the White Cloud entrance handing out the numbers. Then I will call the number, we'll randomize them. Then I'll go ahead and call out the numbers, and then the people can come up and ask their question. Each candidate will take turns answering it first. So candidate X will answer first for the first question, Y first for the second question, so on and so forth. And we'll just keep going in that way. I think that kind of runs through the event. So we'll hand out bios at the front door, so we don't have to take time announcing or having candidates talk about their bio. Yeah, I think that's kind of high level. Do you have other questions around that?
Trustee Ozuna.
I appreciate that we'll save some time there and not have the candidates run through their bio, but are we going to do some sort of a short introduction or allow them to do a very short introduction?
That's something we can discuss on Friday. I just thought that I would introduce all the candidates, and then when people come to the door, we'll have a flyer with the finalists and their bios printed out already. So I thought I would just simply announce their names, but we can, I'm not married to that way. We can have them, just introduce themselves quickly. Either way.
Okay. Trustee Kofelt.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So each candidate will, all 4 will answer. Each question just asked, they will each answer it. Who starts answering it will differ based on the order of the questions, correct?
Madam Chair, Trustees, Dr. Reynolds, so for example, if I get a question, so Trustee Klopfenstein would answer it first, then you, then
Sure.
go down the line. Then the next question, you would answer first, so on, and keep going in that fashion, so that not the same candidate is answering every question for the first time.
Sure. And then
Yeah.
they each have 3 minutes. Is that the time allotment to answer?
Correct.
Okay. I was just trying to do the math in my head. So
Yeah.
for a 2-hour meeting,
Yep.
that's 12 minutes per question.
Yep.
So we're only going to allow
Yep.
10 questions to be asked.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Trustee Ozuna.
This is a question for you, Madam Chair. Do you want us to potentially send some questions your way for a backup list in case we don't have 10 questions come in from staff and patrons? I hope that's not the case, but.
We actually have a spot on here, so what we were gonna do if we don't have the participation that we're anticipating is that we would use from the survey, pull from the survey that patrons submitted and ask those questions.
Okay, so you'll pull those ahead of time, or?
I will.
Okay,
yeah.
Ms. Jackson's pulling
Yeah.
those.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have like a really random question, but I'm just trying to understand how many people with the setup this will be in the room. And I was curious, kind of, we've been having Teacher of the Year in there. About how many people are in the Teacher of the Year banquets? Will the setup be, I mean, obviously we won't have tables, but will the setup be more or less than that?
Well, Madam Chair, Trustees, Dr. Reynolds, based on the attestation form, we're going to keep it under 75. And I don't know the stadium, like that auditorium style setup, how many that will allow with 6 feet apart, but that's what we're going to try to go for. The ceremonies for Teacher of the Year have been around 100, but they filled out their attestation form differently. It was a different event. They had to fill out things for food, for example, where we didn't. So it's just a different event, but it will be a similar amount of people in the room, probably about 20 less than we were seeing at those events.
Okay. And let's talk about that, because I think we can adjust that attestation form if we need to. I just think we should, if we have all those teachers in there for Teacher of the Year and we limit the teachers for asking questions and the patron, that probably would not be good. So let's talk about that and see if we can fix that and allow some similar attestation on that.
Madam Chair, Trustees, we are running out of time because I believe Central District Health wants about 48 hours, so we just have to do that quickly.
Okay, well, let's make it match the Teacher of the Year attestation, and at least for the count of people. So we don't limit our staff in this situation. Is there any other thoughts? All right, thank you, Ms. Jackson, and if you have any other feedback before Friday, we're going to meet for finalization on Friday, so let us know. Clerk, Trustee Kofelt.
This is just, it's related to the day in general. Will there be something coming out about where you'd like the trustees to meet and how we're going to do the tour with the Okay.
Yeah, so that's the next
Did I
piece.
get ahead of you?
Yep.
Sorry about that.
Not really. You're good. You're good. You pushed us to the next spot. You let in. That's what you let in. So Clerk Newble was going to talk about. So Monday is the tour. We'll have these forums in the evening. Tuesday during the day, we'll have the interviews. We do not have a board meeting that night. I'm sure you guys will be happy about that. So let's talk about the tour piece of it.
Madam Chair, Trustees, Superintendent Reynolds, Chairman Johnson has asked me to set up the tours for each of the 3 schools that you have all selected. I will be contacting the principals, the building principals, tomorrow, and I will be talking to them about what exactly that tour will look like in their school, and I will get that information out to you. Mr. Yoakum has volunteered to drive you all around. And I got a van. I'm not sure what color it is. I got a van for you all. And so I would need to know from each of you if you plan to attend that tour. Like I said, I will get that information, the times, out to you tomorrow after I contact the building principals. I also need to make sure that we feed you all at lunch at some point. And so each school will be a little bit different in what the building principal decides. So it might be a tour, it might be in a classroom, it might be, talking with some teachers. So it might be a little different in each school.
As a reminder, we're touring Hillsdale Elementary, Meridian High School, and Eagle Middle School.
Eagle Middle.
And we selected those ones so we could get at, the candidates could see kind of each level of our building kind of structures. Hillsdale Elementary was selected because it has a significant partnership with the YMCA, the City of Meridian, some other areas. So kind of looking at how we've innovated from a partnership standpoint. Meridian High was selected because they have the CTE and some significant CTE tour pieces that we can see, that candidates can see there, because that's a big part of our strategy. And then Eagle Middle, because we wanted to have something north, and they have some, and actually I think the staff selected that one, so I'd look for Clerk Newbold. We just said, let's get something in the other areas of the zone so folks could get an idea of kind of the length and breadth of the zone, and also hit a middle school in there. So so we hit Eagle Middle, which I'm sure they'll show us great things there as well. So so we'll definitely want to hit those things on the tour.
Correct, and I'm thinking the time frame will be 7:30. I'd like everybody back here by 3 so that at least the candidates and you all have an hour before the staff forum.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anybody that won't be able to make the tour? All right. That's great. Thank you, guys. I feel like I'm going to have to buy gift cards for all of you after this. And then the last piece, and Clerk Newbold alluded to this, is the interviews on Tuesday, and ISBA is setting those up, and so they'll send out, like they did last time, the interview schedule. Right now, I'm just, for safety purposes, blocking off 8 to 5, so I've just taken the day off. We'll have at least 4 interviews. We haven't set the time yet, if it's an hour and a half or an hour. And it'll probably depend on somewhat of the feedback we get on the questions that we want to have in there. So, so just if you think about an hour and a half, that probably takes the whole day between breaks in between and stuff like that. So, Trustee Ozuna.
I believe we have Teacher of the Year on that day as well. That
Yes.
we want to work around.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so you don't get to go home until at least 6.
Madam Chair, I have one other question about the day. Are we having a board meeting that allows for an executive session and conversation in between, or how do we need to work that?
So same thing as we've been doing when we did the interviews before. We'll have to have a board meeting, go into executive session, do the interviews. We also can have some discussion in there. We're not limited. And then we'll come back out. We wanted, when we built the schedule, we wanted the board to have, not to have to make an immediate decision. Some of these large decisions sometimes require some, go back and look at. So we gave that extra week. Also, just in case, because we had a shorter time between selecting the finalists and getting them here for interviews, we have some reference checks there, but we also have some opportunity to finish up reference checks after that time frame as well. So we got the full 2 weeks. So with the decision will be on our regular scheduled board meeting on the 27th. But so yes, we will have a meeting, but we won't have anything else on the agenda other than going into executive session like we've been doing with all of the first round of interviews. It's just everybody will be in person this time. Any other on this topic? Questions, comments, thoughts, anything we missed? Because we can, it's anything on the process. Anything you have other questions on? Everybody looks good? All right. I saw item H. I just saw it. Future agenda items. We can keep putting this on, and we don't have to come up with them all tonight. But if there's anything, I don't know about you guys, but it's been a couple weeks, right? So if there's anything now, mention it. If not, we can move on to adjournment. All right, I'm going to look down the dais here to Trustee Klopfenstein.
I move we adjourn.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Motion carries 5-0. We're adjourned.